My mom demanded that I give my corneas to my blind sister. I gave her the truth instead. My mom called me last Tuesday saying we needed to have a serious family meeting about my sister Delia's future. She'd been losing her vision for the past 3 years due to a genetic condition and was now completely blind at 27. I drove 4 hours to my parents' house thinking we would talk about care options, or maybe look into assistance programs I could help pay for. Instead, I walked into what felt like an intervention with my mom, my dad, my Aunt Rhonda, and Delia, all sitting in the living room waiting for me. The lamps were on even though it was still light outside, and there was a plate of cookies on the coffee table that nobody was eating, and I remember thinking that the cookies meant this had been planned for a while. My mom started by saying Delia's doctor had found a potential treatment that could restore her vision, but they needed a cornea donor who was a close genetic match. She said they'd tested everyone in the family, and I was the only one who came back as a match. She said this was my chance to give my sister her whole life back. I asked about the waiting list for donor corneas, and she said Delia couldn't wait that long. Her condition was deteriorating, and the doctor said this needed to happen within the next few months, or the window for the surgery would close for good. My dad sat next to her with his eyes red, saying how hard it had been watching Delia struggle, how she'd lost her job as an illustrator, how her fiancé had called off the engagement, how she barely left her apartment anymore and had started sleeping until noon. Delia just sat there in the armchair with her hands folded in her lap, not saying anything, her face turned slightly toward the window like she was listening for something. I said I needed time to think about it and to research the procedure myself. My mom's whole demeanor changed in a way I recognized from being a kid. She said there was nothing to think about. This was family. This was what a brother did for his sister without being asked twice. She said I had 2 working eyes and Delia had none, and hesitating even for a second was selfish beyond anything she could have imagined raising me to be. She actually used the word selfish, like I was hoarding something that had always belonged to everyone in that room. My Aunt Rhonda chimed in from the love seat, saying she'd give her own corneas in a heartbeat if she were a match, that any decent person would, that she couldn't understand what there was to sit around discussing. She said I should be grateful I was even in a position to help, that most families never got a chance like this. I asked what would happen to my own vision if I donated, and my mom said the doctor had assured them I'd still be able to see adequately with one eye. Adequately, like depth perception and peripheral vision, and being able to catch something tossed at me were just extras I'd been lucky to have and could give back now. She said people lived full lives with one eye every day, that I was young and strong and would adapt in no time, that I'd barely notice after a while. When I said I wanted to talk to the doctor myself before I agreed to anything, she said I was wasting time that Delia didn't have. That's when things started to feel wrong in a way I couldn't name yet. I turned to Delia and asked her what she thought, and she finally spoke up quietly, saying she didn't want to pressure me, that she'd never ask me to do this, but that losing her sight had taken everything from her. She said she understood completely if I couldn't do it, but she also said she'd spend the rest of her life wondering if things could have been different, and I felt that sentence land in my chest like it was designed to. My mom immediately jumped back in, saying it wasn't really asking when the answer was this obvious, that a good brother wouldn't make his blind sister beg. She pulled out her phone and started showing me photos of Delia from before, at art shows, on a beach in Portugal, laughing at somebody's wedding with a drink in her hand. Then she scrolled to recent ones. Delia sitting alone in a dim apartment. Delia with a white cane at the grocery store looking lost. Delia crying. She held the phone up to my face and said this was on me now, that every day I hesitated was a day of this. My dad said they'd already spoken with a surgeon and penciled in tentative dates for the following month. He said they'd put down a deposit that wasn't refundable. He said they'd told Delia's old friends the good news that she'd be seeing again by summer. My mom added that she'd already bought Delia a set of professional art supplies for when she recovered. New brushes and paints, the expensive kind, sitting wrapped in Delia's closet waiting. Everything had been arranged. Everything was in place. The only piece missing was me actually saying yes. I stood up and said I needed to leave and clear my head, and my mom stepped between me and the front door. She said I wasn't leaving that house until I agreed to help my sister. She said if I walked out that door tonight, I was walking out of this family for good, that she would not have a son who could look at his blind sister and choose himself. She said she'd cut me off completely, that I could forget having parents, that Delia would be able to say her own brother chose his comfort over her eyes. My dad stood up too and put a hand on my shoulder and begged me to just say yes, said they'd be with me through every day of the recovery, that they'd cover all of it, that I'd be a hero to this whole family. I pushed past my mom's arm and pulled the door open and left. She was still talking when I got to my car. The next 3 days were a blur of noise. They called constantly, both numbers over and over. My mom left voicemails saying I was letting my sister go blind out of spite, that she couldn't believe what I'd become. My dad texted photos of Delia struggling to pour coffee, Delia feeling along a countertop. My Aunt Rhonda started posting things online about ungrateful children and how some people forget where they come from, vague enough to deny but pointed enough that everyone knew. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in a year started messaging me asking why I wouldn't help my poor sister, saying they'd heard I was refusing, saying they never would have expected this from me. Then I did something my mom didn't expect. I called Delia's doctor myself. His office had it on file that I was listed as a family contact from an old form, so the receptionist put me through when I said it was about a potential living donation, and Dr. Rao. Brennan went quiet on the phone for a second when I explained why I was calling. Then he told me there was no revolutionary cornea surgery scheduled for my sister. Delia was on the standard transplant waiting list, the same as everyone else with her condition, and she'd most likely receive donor corneas within the year through the normal process. He said he had never once discussed living donation with my family, because that is not how cornea transplants work for a degenerative condition like Delia's. You cannot take a healthy cornea out of a living person for someone else's elective surgery. He said the only situations where anything close to that even gets considered involve emergency trauma, and even then it is extraordinarily rare and requires an ethics board and a level of review that no scheduling deposit could ever bypass. He asked me carefully who exactly had told me otherwise. When I told him my mother had gathered the whole family to inform me I was the only genetic match and that a surgeon was already holding dates, there was a long pause, and he said quietly that none of that had come from him or anyone in his office. He sounded genuinely disturbed. He said he was sorry I'd been put in that position. I sat in my car outside a gas station for 20 minutes after I hung up, gripping my phone so hard my hand ached, watching the numbers on the pump across from me without reading them. My hands were shaking, but my head felt strangely clear and cold, like I'd stepped a foot to the left of my own body and could finally see the whole shape of the last 3 years without the fog of guilt they'd been pumping into me since before I could drive. Every family dinner, every phone call, every time I'd apologized for something I now couldn't remember doing wrong, all of it rearranged itself in my mind like furniture sliding into place. My phone buzzed with another call from my mom, and I let it ring all the way through to voicemail and didn't move. Then I started the car and pulled out of the lot, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I drove the 4 hours home instead of turning around to confront them because I knew I needed distance and a plan before I ever walked back into that living room. The whole drive, the voicemails kept coming, my mom's voice getting sharper and colder in each one, demanding to know where I'd disappeared to, accusing me of abandoning my sister when she needed me most, telling me I'd regret this for the rest of my life. By the time I crossed back into my own city, she'd left 9 of them, each one worse than the last. My dad started texting somewhere in the second hour, softer than her, asking where I was, saying we could still fix this, begging me to come back so we could work it out as a family. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't answer a single one. I got home a little after midnight and immediately sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and started searching things like family pressure organ donation and manufactured medical emergency and how to know if your family is manipulating you. My screen was the only light in the apartment, and everything I read described almost exactly what had just happened to me. The invented crisis, the ticking clock that leaves no time to verify, the money already spent to make backing out feel like a betrayal, the whole room of people arranged so you're outnumbered. I felt sick reading it because it was so common that there were templates for it, patterns with names, and I'd walked into the oldest one there was. There were articles about coercive control, about families who used a sick member as leverage over a healthy one, about the specific psychological tricks that make a person doubt their own sense of right and wrong. I read for close to 3 hours, taking notes on a legal pad, bookmarking pages, feeling my entire childhood get rewritten paragraph by paragraph until it was almost light outside. The next morning I called my friend Desmond, because he'd known my family for years, but had never been close enough to them to get pulled into anything. I told him the whole thing, start to finish, the meeting and the cornea demand and the deposit and Dr. Brennan on the phone, and there was this long silence on the line before he said it back to me slowly, like he needed to hear himself say it to believe it. He said my own mother had tried to get me to give up an eye based on a surgery that did not exist. Hearing another person put it in that flat, plain sentence made it real in a way it hadn't been even when the doctor said it, and I felt something crack open in me, and I started crying, standing in my kitchen at 9 in the morning, the first time I'd cried since I was a teenager. Desmond didn't say anything cheesy or try to fix it. He just stayed on the line and let me get it out, and then he asked if he could come over. He showed up an hour later with 2 coffees and his laptop, and we spent most of the day at my table documenting everything. The timeline of the meeting, who said what, the exact medical lies, what Dr. Brennan had actually told me, the deposit story, the art supplies, the blocked door. He pulled up templates people used to document abuse and coercion and helped me fill them in with dates and direct quotes while they were still fresh. At one point he stopped typing and looked at me and said I should probably talk to a lawyer because what they'd tried to do might not just be cruel, it might actually be illegal. By that evening my phone showed 41 missed calls and dozens of texts from various relatives. My dad's messages swung back and forth between begging me to come home and telling me I was breaking my mother's heart. My mom's were pure ice, calling me a coward, saying she'd raised a stranger, saying she hoped I could live with what I was doing to Delia. My aunt Rhonda sent a long message about how ashamed my late grandfather would be of me, how family sticks together through everything, how I was tearing everyone apart with my stubbornness. A cousin texted asking if it was true I'd had some kind of breakdown, because that was what my parents were telling telling people. I blocked both my parents' numbers that night just so I could think. And the second I did it, I felt a wave of guilt so strong it almost made me unblock them again, even though I knew, because I'd read about it just hours earlier, that the guilt itself was the thing they'd trained into me. Desmond pointed out that a healthy family does not make you feel like a criminal for needing one night of quiet to process being lied to, and that one sentence broke something else open in me. I cried again, harder, and he sat there on my couch and let me. 2 days later, I called Dr. Brennan's office back and asked if he'd be willing to put in writing what he'd told me on the phone. He got on the line himself and said he'd been thinking about our call and had actually been a little worried about me since. He said he would absolutely provide a written statement confirming that he had never discussed living cornea donation with my family and that no such procedure was medically viable for Delia's condition and that she was on the standard transplant list. Then he asked me gently if I was safe, whether my family was harassing me, and I realized for the first time how the whole thing looked from the outside, how a doctor hearing this story would immediately clock it as a warning sign. He said he'd email me the signed statement by the end of the day and told me to reach out if I needed anything else at all. That statement landed in my inbox that afternoon on his practice's letterhead, and I read it 4 times and then saved 3 copies in 3 different places. Desmond found me a legal aid clinic, and they connected me with an attorney named Lorena who worked on family coercion and elder and dependent abuse cases. I told her everything over the phone, and she said that while criminal cases against family members were complicated and slow, what they had done could arguably rise to attempted fraud and financial exploitation, and that at the very minimum, I needed to document everything in case I ever wanted a protective order. She offered to meet with me that same week. In her office, she helped me draft a formal cease contact letter to my parents, stating plainly that I knew the cornea surgery was fabricated, that I had written documentation from Delia's actual doctor, and that I needed space and no further contact while I processed what they'd done. She said writing it in cold legal language was safer than any conversation, because a conversation was exactly the terrain they were good at, and I wasn't. The letter included a line that any continued harassment would result in legal action, and that all future communication should go through her office. She printed it on the firm's letterhead, and we sent it certified mail so there would be a signed record that they received it. My phone rang 2 hours later while I was reheating leftover rice for dinner. I didn't know the number, but I answered because I thought it might be Lorena calling from a second line. It was my mom. Her voice came through quiet and level, in that controlled register she used to use right before things got bad when I was a kid, the one that used to drop my stomach through the floor. She spoke slowly and patiently, like she was explaining something obvious to a child who was being difficult on purpose. She said I'd been listening to the wrong people, that someone on the outside, someone who didn't understand our family, had gotten in my head and poisoned me against the people who loved me. She said her son would never turn his back on his blind sister like this on his own, so somebody must have put these ideas in me. She kept circling back to the same question. Who had I been talking to? What had they told me? Why was I letting a stranger blow up our family over a misunderstanding? I gripped the phone with both hands to keep them still, and then I looked at the screen and saw it was my Aunt Rhonda's number. My mom had called me from Rhonda's phone so I wouldn't see her name and decline. Desmond had told me to record any call from my family if I could, so while she kept talking, I fumbled through my phone's settings and got a recording going. And the second I did, her tone shifted, softened, went sad and warm. She said she loved me more than I could understand, that a mother's love doesn't just switch off over one argument, that family was forever no matter what got said in anger. She said I'd regret burning these bridges one day when I was older and alone and reached for family that wasn't there anymore. She said Delia was crying herself to sleep every night because her own brother had abandoned her. Every sentence sounded loving on its face and felt like a threat underneath, like she was describing the weather in a place she planned to strand me. I told her I'd spoken to Dr. Brennan directly and had his written statement saying the surgery was never real. The line went completely silent for a good 5 seconds, long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. Then it just ended. No goodbye, nothing. I stood in my kitchen with the phone still against my ear, listening to dead air, and my hands would not stop shaking. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw my dad standing in the hallway in a windbreaker, holding his car keys, looking older and smaller than I remembered him ever looking. He wasn't supposed to know where I lived, because I'd moved since the last time either of them had visited, which meant he'd gotten my address from somewhere. He said through the door that he'd driven up alone, that my mom didn't know he was there, that he just needed 10 minutes to talk to me face to face. Part of me wanted to leave him standing in that hallway, but another part, the part that remembered him teaching me to ride a bike and letting me fall asleep in the car on long drives and pretending not to notice when I cried at movies, opened the door. He asked if he could come in, and his eyes were already wet like he'd been working himself up to this the whole drive. I let him in against every single thing I'd read. He sat on my couch and started talking before I'd even shut the door, saying they'd only ever wanted to help Delia, that maybe some details about the surgery had gotten confused along the way, but that their hearts had been in the right place the whole time. I asked him which details specifically had gotten confused, and he said, well, the doctor had mentioned transplants at some point, so they'd assumed a living donation might be one of the options on the table. I pointed out that Dr. Brennan had told me directly he'd never discussed living donation with them at all, and my dad pivoted to saying maybe they'd misunderstood him, that medical terminology was confusing, that they'd just been trying to make sense of Delia's options like any desperate parents would. I asked whether the surgeon had actually scheduled dates and taken a deposit, and he admitted after a pause that no surgeon had been booked, but that my mom had been calling around researching clinics that might be willing to do it. His story shifted every single time I asked a direct question. First, the surgery was real but simplified, then it was a misunderstanding, then it was my mom trying to find creative solutions because the real waiting list was too slow. He never once said the words "we lied" or "I'm sorry." He just kept repositioning the whole thing as a misunderstanding born of love and fear. I finally asked him straight out whether he had known the surgery wasn't real when they sat me down in that living room with the whole family arranged around me. His face crumpled and he said I was being cruel, that I was cross-examining my own father instead of thinking about how much my sister was suffering. He said he'd come all this way hoping I would understand how terrified they'd been of losing Delia to the darkness she was living in, that they'd been willing to try anything, that a family is supposed to hold each other up when things are this hard. Every time I tried to steer back to whether he'd known the truth, he steered to Delia's pain, to my coldness, to how disappointed everyone was. After nearly an hour of circles, he stood up and said he'd tried, that he couldn't do anything more if I was this determined to think the worst of the people who raised me, and he left. I sat on my couch afterward feeling like I'd been hit by a car, wrung out, and somehow more confused than before he'd shown up. Desmond came over that evening after I texted him, and I walked him through the whole conversation trying to figure out what had actually happened in it. He listened to all of it and then pointed out something I'd half noticed and refused to see, which was that my dad had never actually answered a single direct question I'd asked. He'd cried and redirected and made me feel guilty for asking, and that was the entire content of the visit. He was right, and knowing it made me feel worse, like I'd just lost a second parent instead of only my mom. What stuck with me most, going back over it, was one moment near the end when I'd finally stopped chasing the truth and just asked him plainly what he actually wanted from the visit, what outcome he'd driven 4 hours for, and he'd said, without hesitating, that he wanted his family back, that he wanted things to go back to how they were, not that he wanted to make it right, not that he wanted to understand what they'd done. He wanted things to go back to how they were, which was the whole problem stated out loud without him even realizing it, because how they were was precisely what had nearly cost me my sight. He wasn't asking for repair. He was asking me to climb back into the machine and let it keep running, and to do it quietly so that the piece he'd spent 30 years protecting could go undisturbed. Desmond, when I told him that part, went quiet for a second, and then said that at least it was honest in its way, that at least my dad had told me the truth about what he was offering, which was nothing, dressed up as everything. It was a small, dark comfort, but it was a comfort knowing exactly what was and wasn't on the table so I could stop hoping for a thing that had never been there. The phone calls started 3 days later. My cousin Dahlia called asking why I'd changed my mind about helping Delia after I'd agreed to the surgery, saying my parents were devastated over the deposit they'd lost. I told her I had never agreed to any surgery and that there was no real surgery to agree to, and she went quiet, then said that wasn't what she'd heard at all. My uncle called the next day with almost the same story, except in his version I'd gotten cold feet at the last minute and walked out on Delia days before her scheduled procedure. My mom's other sister called saying she understood being scared of surgery, but that backing out after everyone had made arrangements was one of the most selfish things she'd heard of. Each person had slightly different details, but the same core story, one where I was the villain who'd promised to save my sister's sight and then vanished. And the details being wrong in different ways was itself the proof, because it meant my parents were actively feeding people a script, and no two of them had memorized it the same. Not one of these relatives mentioned that the surgery had never been real, or that I'd discovered the whole thing was invented. In the family's version of events, I'd eagerly agreed to donate a cornea. They'd booked everything and paid deposits, and then I'd cruelly changed my mind and disappeared to punish everyone. I called Lorena, and we drafted a short factual email to the relatives who seemed most reasonable, attaching Dr. Brennan's written statement proving the surgery was never medically possible, and explaining plainly that I had never agreed to anything because there had never been anything real to agree to. I sent it to about 15 family members and waited to see who would actually read the evidence in front of them. Roughly half never responded at all, just went silent after the email, which told me they'd rather not know. 3 cousins and 1 great aunt wrote back apologizing for believing the story without asking me, saying they should have come to me directly. 2 relatives, my uncle among them, got angry at me instead, saying I was airing private family business to outsiders, that showing a doctor's letter around made my parents look like liars in front of everyone. My uncle wrote that even if some of the surgery details had been exaggerated, my parents had only been trying to help my disabled sister, and that dragging documents into it made me vindictive and disloyal. It was the first time I really understood that for some people the truth genuinely did not matter, that all that mattered was whether you disrupted the story the family had agreed to tell about itself. That was a hard thing to absorb, harder than the lie itself in some ways. I'd walked into sending those emails with a naive faith that evidence would settle it, that once people saw a doctor's signed statement in black and white, they'd have no choice but to come around, and some did. But watching my uncle read the same document I read and come away angrier at me for showing it than at my parents for needing it exposed taught me something about how families actually work, which is that the shared story is load-bearing, that people build their whole sense of who they are on top of it, and that a person who threatens the story threatens everything sitting on it, so they'd often rather attack the messenger than let the floor give way. Dr. Nasser called it the family's immune system, the way a dysfunctional system will attack the healthiest response as if it were the disease. She told me not to measure my sanity by how many relatives believed me, because belief in that family had never once been about evidence, and that if I made my peace of mind depend on convincing them, I'd handed them the exact leverage they'd always had. I stopped sending mass emails after that. I'd made the record. Who chose to read it honestly was no longer my job to control. Work got hard to focus on because my brain kept replaying conversations and analyzing them mid-task. I'd be halfway through a spreadsheet and suddenly hear my dad's voice saying maybe some details got confused, or I'd be in a meeting and realize I hadn't absorbed a word for 5 minutes. A guy on my team named Ruben stopped by my desk one afternoon and asked if I wanted to grab a coffee, and something in how he asked made it clear he'd noticed I'd been somewhere else for weeks. We walked to the place across the street, and he asked directly but kindly if something was going on. I gave him the shortened version, just that my family had lied about a medical emergency to try to pressure me into something, and now they were spreading false stories about me. He listened without interrupting, then told me he'd gone no contact with his own parents 3 years earlier over similar patterns. He said his mother had used his younger brother's addiction as a lever to control the entire family, making everyone permanently responsible for a crisis she refused to ever actually address, and that he'd finally understood he couldn't be in a relationship with people who saw him as a tool for managing someone else rather than a person in his own right. He said the guilt never fully went away, but it stopped running his life. Before we walked back, he wrote down the name and number of his therapist on a napkin and slid it across the table and said she specialized in family systems and that talking to her had probably saved his life, and he meant it, I could tell. I called Dr. Farah Nasser's office the next day and got an appointment for that Thursday afternoon. Her waiting room had soft gray walls and a white noise machine humming in the corner, and I filled out intake forms asking about my family history and current stress. When she brought me back to her office and I sat down across from her, I started crying before she'd even finished asking her first question, and I apologized for it, and she handed me a box of tissues and said there was nothing to apologize for, that this was a place where I could feel whatever was actually there. I asked her, before anything else, if I was crazy, if maybe my parents really had just misunderstood the medical situation and I was being too hard on people who were only scared for my sister. She asked me to walk her through exactly what had happened, and I told her everything: the ambush meeting, the blocked door, the phone call to Dr. Brennan, my dad's shifting story on my couch. She listened all the way through, and then she gave me words I'd never had before: gaslighting, enmeshment, scapegoating, narcissistic family systems. She explained that gaslighting was making a person doubt their own memory and perception of reality, which was precisely what they were doing every time they insisted they'd just misunderstood medical terminology, when in fact they had invented an entire surgery from nothing. She said enmeshment was when the boundaries between family members got so blurred that individual needs disappeared into the needs of the unit, and that I'd apparently been raised from childhood to treat Delia's needs as automatically more important than my own, to the point where I'd stopped noticing I had needs at all. Suddenly there were names for things I'd felt my entire life without ever being able to point at. She was careful, though, not to just hand me a set of labels and send me off armed with them. She said the words were tools, not weapons, that the point of naming what had happened to me was not to win an argument against my family, but to stop losing the argument I'd been having with myself for 30 years, the one where I was always somehow the problem. She asked me, near the end of that first session, what I was most afraid of, and I surprised myself by saying, out loud, that I was afraid I was a bad person, that a good person wouldn't be able to refuse his blind sister anything, that maybe my parents were monsters, and maybe they were right about me, and both of those could be true at once. She let that sit in the room for a moment, and then she said gently that a bad person does not lie awake at night terrified of being a bad person, that the very fact I was tormented by the question was itself the answer, and that people like my parents almost never asked it about themselves at all. I drove home from that first appointment and had to sit in my car in the lot outside her building for 20 minutes before I could drive, not crying exactly, just breathing, feeling something enormous shift by a few degrees. I went back the next week and the week after that. During that third session, Dr. Nasser asked me to tell her about other times my family had used pressure like this, and once I started, I couldn't stop. I told her about the scholarship, a full ride to a university 6 hours away that I'd turned down at 18 because my mom said I was needed at home to help with Delia, who was just starting to lose her vision back then, and she'd framed it so gently, as the obvious choice any loving brother would make, that I'd let it go without ever really questioning it. Then I remembered the the money my grandfather had left me, which had quietly been redirected into Delia's medical costs my junior year. My dad sitting me down to explain that Delia needed it more and that I'd understand when I was older. I remembered a job offer in another state at 23 that my mom had cried over until I turned it down, saying it was selfish to move away when my sister was struggling, that I should be grateful I could even move at all when Delia would need help for the rest of her life. I remembered a car, a used one I'd saved for, that had ended up becoming Delia's after her diagnosis because she needed rides, and it wasn't fair for me to have wheels when she couldn't drive. I'd filed every one of these away as normal, as the kind of thing a decent brother does, but saying them out loud one after another in that quiet office, I saw the shape of it, a pattern stretching back more than a decade. Every single time I'd wanted something for myself, there had been a reason Delia needed it more, a reason wanting it made me selfish, a reason a good son and a good brother would give it up without complaint. The cornea demand wasn't the first time. It was just the first time they'd asked for a piece of my actual body, and even that had followed the exact same script as everything before it. I kept remembering more of them all week, the way you do once you finally have a shape to hang the memories on. The birthday when I was 12, when my party got quietly folded into a fundraiser for Delia's first specialist, because it fell in the same month, and how I'd been made to feel selfish for being disappointed. The way I'd learned, without ever being told directly, to answer the question, how are you, with a report on how Delia was doing, because my own state had simply stopped being a thing anyone in that house asked about. The summer job money at 16 that had gone toward the family instead of the used amp I'd been saving for, and how my mom had praised me for weeks afterward for being so mature, so giving, so unlike other selfish teenagers, and how much I'd needed that praise, how I'd have handed over anything to keep it coming. I saw, laid out across a decade, the whole quiet machinery of it, the way approval in my family had always been a wage paid out for self-erasure, the way I'd been trained to experience the act of disappearing as the feeling of being loved. When I brought all of this to Dr. Nasser, she didn't look surprised. She said this was the part that always came, once someone started really looking, that the headline event, in my case the cornea, was almost never the real story, that the real story was the 1,000 small trainings that had made the headline event feel, for one terrible evening in that living room, almost reasonable. She said the fact that I'd needed a doctor on the phone to tell me my own eye was mine was the clearest measure of how thoroughly it had been done to me. I spent another week with my parents blocked, letting the silence stretch until it stopped feeling like avoidance and started feeling like the first real room of my own I'd ever had. Then one night I sat on my couch and unblocked both their numbers. My heart was slamming as I typed the message, deleting and rewriting it 3 or 4 times to get it exactly right. The final version was short and left no room to be twisted or reinterpreted. I wrote that I knew the surgery was fabricated, that I had a signed statement from Dr. Brennan proving it, that I needed 6 months of no contact to process what they'd done, and that any more harassment would result in a restraining order. I hit send and immediately flipped my phone face down on the coffee table, like that could protect me from whatever came back. My mom's reply arrived in under 2 minutes, and I grabbed the phone before I could stop myself. It was one long, unbroken paragraph, no punctuation, just a wall of words calling me dead to her, saying I'd chosen strangers over my own blood, that I was spitting on every sacrifice she'd made to raise me, that I was a liar and a traitor, and she hoped I'd have to live with the guilt of my sister's blindness for the rest of my life. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting to feel the guilt she was clearly trying to detonate in me. Instead, I just felt tired and sad, the way you feel watching someone set fire to their own house while insisting you're the one holding the match. My dad's texts came right after, softer, a stream of apologies and pleading, saying I was breaking his heart, that he didn't understand how it had come to this, that surely we could still fix it if I'd just call. He sent a photo of Delia sitting alone at the kitchen table, then another one. I turned my phone all the way off and went to bed, and for the first time in weeks I slept the whole night through without waking up once. 2 days later, Delia texted me from her own number, and I stared at her name on my screen for a full minute before I opened it. Her message was different from our parents', softer, more careful, laid out almost too neatly. She started by saying she knew things had gotten complicated. She wrote that maybe our parents had exaggerated some of the details about the surgery, that everyone had been desperate and frightened, that she was drowning in what it meant to be blind and had let herself believe I might want to help her. She said she understood that I was angry, but she hoped we could work through this as brother and sister, because at the end of the day we only had each other. The whole message felt rehearsed, like she'd written and rewritten it, or like someone had helped her. I could hear my mom's phrasing in certain lines, the way Delia framed a deliberate lie as a misunderstanding, the way the entire thing was built around her suffering and never once around what they'd tried to take from me. I pictured her at the kitchen table with our parents leaning over her shoulder, everyone workshopping the exact wording to push the exact buttons. I sat on it for a full day and talked it through with Dr. Nasser, who helped me see that if I let Delia control the frame with a vague, not quite apology, I'd be pulled right back into the fog. She said I needed to ask a single direct question and let the answer, or the absence of one, tell me what I needed to know. So I typed back one line with nothing softer softening it. I asked whether she had known the cornea surgery wasn't real when we were all in that living room. I hit send and watched it change to delivered, then to read. And then I waited. Hours passed, then a full day, then a second day of total silence that said more than any sentence could have. When her reply finally came, it was long, several paragraphs, and it managed to never once answer the question I'd asked. She wrote about how her blindness made her dependent on our parents to interpret everything medical for her, how she had to trust what they told her, how she was a victim in this too. She described how frightened she was all the time, how she couldn't work or read or recognize a face, how she'd been desperate enough to grab at any hope anyone offered. She said, if our parents had bent the truth, it was only because they loved her and wanted to fix what couldn't be fixed. The entire message was engineered to make me feel like a monster for asking, to slide the focus off the lie and onto her pain. I read it 3 times looking for a single sentence where she said yes, I knew, or no, I didn't, and there wasn't one. There was only context and grief arranged to make the question itself seem cruel. I showed it to Desmond the next time he came by, and he read it twice and then said the thing I'd already started to understand, that a non-answer that careful is its own kind of answer. Desmond suggested we actually research Delia's condition ourselves, find out what her real situation was instead of trusting anything that had ever come out of my parents' mouths. We spent an evening going through medical sites and patient forums, learning about the specific degenerative disorder that had taken her sight. He found a couple of support communities for people living with the same condition, and I made an anonymous account, username just a string of random characters so nothing traced back to me, and posted a careful, vague question asking whether anyone had ever heard of living cornea donation being offered as a treatment for a degenerative condition. The answers started coming within the hour. Person after person confirmed it was not a real treatment. Several shared stories of desperate relatives who'd fallen for scam clinics promising miracle cures, or who'd fundamentally misunderstood how the legitimate transplant list worked. One person wrote about an uncle who'd spent thousands at a fake treatment center overseas. Another described their own father pressuring them for years about a living donation that their doctor eventually had to explain was medically impossible. Reading all of it made my chest tight, a strange mix of relief that I wasn't crazy and grief that my family had done to me, something common enough that a forum full of strangers recognized it instantly. I brought printouts of the whole thread to my next session with Dr. Nasser, spreading them across her coffee table like evidence at a trial. She read through them and then looked at me with an expression that was both sad and a little proud. She helped me hold 2 things at once about Delia: that she was genuinely a victim of our parents' manipulation, and that she had also chosen to participate in it, sitting silent in that room, playing the role. Dr. Nasser said I could have real compassion for how unbearable Delia's life had become and still keep a hard boundary about the lie, that those 2 things didn't cancel each other out. She pointed out that Delia's deflections and non-answers were themselves manipulation, learned in the same house I grew up in, watching our parents twist reality until nobody could hold them accountable. The session left me clearer but lonelier, sitting with the possibility that even my relationship with my sister might be too damaged to save. That weekend I made myself do something new, something that scared me in a way that had nothing to do with my parents. I went to a support group for adults dealing with family estrangement that met in the basement of a community church across town. Walking into that room felt like admitting out loud that my family was actually broken, not just going through a bad stretch we'd eventually patch. Everyone sat in a loose circle of mismatched folding chairs, and we went around the room, first names only, each person giving a short version of why they were there. When it got to me, I said my name and said I'd recently cut contact with my parents after finding out they'd lied about a medical emergency to try to pressure me into something, and my voice cracked on the last few words, and I had to stop before I lost it in front of a room of strangers. The man next to me leaned over and gripped my shoulder for a second. When his turn came, he shared that his family had spent 2 years trying to pressure him into donating a kidney to his brother, framing it as an emergency, calling him selfish and cold every time he asked a question, until he finally got his brother's actual doctor on the phone and learned his brother was on a standard waiting list and in no immediate danger, that the crisis had been manufactured to make him agree before he could think. The overlap with my own story was so exact that I felt my eyes go hot before he'd even finished, and I sat there and cried quietly through the rest of his turn and through the next 2 people, not out of sadness exactly, but out of the specific relief of hearing your own life described by someone who'd survived it. By the end of the meeting, I felt hollowed out, but less alone than I'd been in months, sitting in a room full of people who understood that sometimes the family you were born into is the one you have to walk away from to survive. I stayed after that first meeting to help stack the folding chairs, mostly because I wasn't ready to be alone in my car yet, and the man who'd shared about the kidney-stacked chairs beside me and told me, without my asking, that the first year was the hardest, that the guilt would come in waves and the family would test the boundary over and over in 100 creative ways, and that the single most useful thing anyone had told him was that a boundary isn't a boundary until it's been ignored, and you've held it anyway. He said the holding was the whole thing. Anyone can draw a line. The work is what you do the 40th time they step over it. I didn't fully understand understand yet how much I'd need those words, but I wrote them down in the Notes app on my phone in the parking lot before I drove home, and I read them more times over the following months than I read almost anything else. I went back the next week, and I kept going, and the room slowly stopped being a confession of failure and started being the closest thing I had to a place that made sense. A few days later, a certified letter arrived at my apartment with my parents' names in the return corner, and my stomach dropped just seeing the handwriting. I signed for it and carried it inside and stared at the envelope for 20 minutes before I could make myself open it. Inside was a letter from a lawyer threatening to sue me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress because I'd shared Dr. Brennan's statement with relatives. The language was dense and full of words like damages and liability, designed to make me feel like I'd committed a serious crime by telling the truth. I called Lorena in a near panic and read the whole thing to her, my voice climbing with every paragraph. She listened calmly and then told me exactly what I needed to hear, that this was a textbook intimidation tactic with essentially no legal merit, that truth is a complete defense against a defamation claim, and that I had documentation proving every single thing I'd said was accurate. She told me to make copies and add the letter to my file, because a threatening lawyer letter sent to someone who'd only stated documented facts actually strengthened my position if I ever needed that protective order. She said people who are in the right rarely need to threaten lawsuits to make you stop telling the truth. My cousin Renata called me the following week, her voice tight in a way that made me brace for something. She said she needed to tell me something I probably didn't want to hear. She said my parents were now spreading a new story through the family, telling people I'd had a mental breakdown, that I was making wild false accusations because I wasn't stable, and that they were pointing at the fact that I'd started seeing a therapist as proof I was mentally ill and couldn't be trusted. Renata said she didn't believe a word of it, but thought I deserved to know what was being said, especially since some relatives were taking it at face value. I thanked her and hung up, and then sat down on my bathroom floor and felt a rage so clean and total it made my hands shake. They'd done everything else and I'd absorbed it, but taking the thing I was doing to heal from what they'd done to me and weaponizing it into evidence that I was the sick one felt like a different category of betrayal. I'd walked into therapy to recover from their abuse, and they'd turned my recovery into ammunition. That was the night I stopped hoping on any level that they would ever choose honesty if it cost them the story. Work became the one place I felt like a normal person, where I was just competent and useful and nobody knew my family had tried to talk me out of an eye. I threw myself into it harder than was probably healthy, staying late, volunteering for anything that came up, because going home meant sitting alone with thoughts I wasn't ready to sit with. Ruben noticed the shift, the way I'd gone from checked out to almost frantic with productivity. He started quietly making sure I actually ate, swinging by my desk with a coffee, dragging me out for a walk around the block at lunch, never pushing me to explain, just staying near enough that I knew someone had noticed I wasn't okay. I was grateful for it in a way I didn't have the words for yet. 3 months after the meeting at my parents' house, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost let it go, because I'd gotten wary of unknown numbers after my dad turned up at my door. But something made me pick up. It was Delia, crying so hard I could barely make out her first few words. She said living at home had become unbearable, that the house was tense and miserable every single day, that our mom was furious all the time and our dad had gone quiet and gray, that she couldn't take being trapped in the middle of it anymore. She said she needed me to come back and fix things because she didn't know how much longer she could stand it. I listened to her sob and felt my heart tear straight down the middle, between the sister I'd grown up loving and the person who'd sat silent in that armchair while our parents tried to convince me to give her my eye based on a lie. I told her, as gently as I could, that none of this was my fault. I hadn't created the situation by finding out the truth. They'd created it by lying in the first place, and I was not responsible for cleaning up the fallout of choices they'd made. Delia's voice went sharp and cold in an instant. She said I was being selfish and self-righteous, that I was punishing her for something our parents did, that she was the one suffering now because of my stubbornness, and that I could end all of it by just coming home and letting everything go back to how it was. And in that moment, I understood that she still did not see herself as having played any part in it. She'd sat there while they lied about a surgery that could have cost me half my sight. She'd let it happen. She'd played the fragile victim in the exact spot the scene required, and in her own mind, she was nothing but a bystander caught in someone else's storm. I told her I had to go, and I hung up before she could say anything else, and then I sat in the dark for a long time. My next session with Dr. Nasser was 2 days later. I told her about Delia's call, and how she'd cast herself as one more victim of our parents. Dr. Nasser listened and then started explaining how dysfunction gets handed down through a family like an inheritance. She said my mom had almost certainly learned these exact tactics from her own parents, that she'd grown up in a system where guilt and coercion were just the normal tools for getting what you wanted, and that she was running the only program she'd ever been given. She explained that families like mine tend to organize themselves around protecting the most fragile member, and that everyone else's needs quietly become secondary to that project. Delia's blindness had made her the fragile center, so the whole structure of the family had bent itself around keeping keeping her comfortable, even when comfort meant asking her brother to sacrifice his own body. Dr. Nasser said that breaking a pattern like that almost always gets you cast as the crazy one, the difficult one, the ungrateful one, because the family needs somebody to blame for the discomfort of things changing, and it's always whoever first starts demanding honesty and boundaries. She said that person was me now, and that it was a lonely job but a necessary one, because the alternative was staying inside the dysfunction to avoid being the bad guy and letting the whole thing roll forward into the next generation unchanged. 3 days after that session, I was scrolling on my phone during a lunch break at work when I saw a post shared by one of my mom's friends. It was a fundraising campaign for Delia's medical expenses. The description made my stomach turn. It talked about Delia's brave struggle with sudden blindness, mentioned a promising treatment that could restore her vision, and heavily implied that family circumstances had made it impossible for her to receive the surgery she needed. The wording was careful and lawyered, never once naming me or directly saying someone had backed out, but anyone reading it would come away certain that some family member had failed to save her. The campaign had already raised almost $4,000 in under a week. The comments were full of friends and distant relatives offering prayers and donations, saying how heartbreaking it was that this poor girl couldn't get the help that would let her see again. I sat in my car in the parking garage staring at my screen, feeling genuinely sick. They were now taking money from strangers using the same fabricated surgery they'd tried to use to take my eye, and every one of those people believed they were funding something real. I took screenshots of the entire campaign, the description, the comments, the total raised, and texted them to Lorena and Dr. Nasser asking what I should do. Lorena called me back within the hour. She said this was no longer just family manipulation. This was potentially actual fraud, soliciting donations based on a medical claim they knew to be false, which violated the fundraising platform's terms and possibly state law. She said that because I had Dr. Brennan's signed statement proving the surgery wasn't real, I could report the campaign with real evidence and it would very likely be taken down. But she warned me plainly that doing it would set off an explosion, that my parents would know for certain I was actively working against them, not just keeping my distance. Dr. Nasser said something similar when I brought it to her that week. She asked whether I was truly prepared for the fallout of exposing them in public, even though what they were doing was wrong. I sat with it. I thought about all those people giving money they'd worked for based on a lie, about my parents literally profiting off the same scheme they'd tried to run on my body. I told them both I wanted to report it. Lorena helped me file the fraud report with the platform's trust and safety team. I submitted Dr. Brennan's written statement, the full timeline of events, and screenshots of my parents' own text messages pressuring me toward a surgery he'd confirmed was never real. The legal aid clinic added a letter laying out the situation from their side, and then I waited. Those 6 days were some of the hardest of the whole ordeal, harder in a way than the ambush itself, because I'd made an active choice this time. I'd reached out and pulled a lever against my own family instead of just defending myself, and there was no unpulling it. I barely slept. I kept opening the campaign page to see if it was still up, and it always was, the donation total ticking upward, more prayers and heartfelt comments piling on underneath, each new one another stranger handing money to a lie I now knew about and had chosen to act on. I second-guessed myself constantly. I asked Dr. Nasser, in an emergency session I booked mid-week, whether reporting my own parents for fraud made me the cruel one after all, whether there was some line I'd crossed from protecting myself into punishing them. She asked me a single question that settled it. She asked whether I'd be comfortable letting a stranger, a real person with a real job and real bills, donate their money based on a medical claim I knew for a fact was false, just to spare my parents a consequence, and I wasn't. When I put it that way, letting it continue would have made me complicit in the exact thing that had been done to me, and I couldn't do it. I started to think the platform wouldn't care, that money would win, that the report would vanish into some queue and nothing would ever come of it. Then, on the 7th day, the campaign was gone. In its place was a message saying it had been removed for violating community guidelines. Lorena told me afterward that my parents had been required to refund every donation, and that the platform had flagged their account to block them from ever starting another campaign. For one clean afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt through the entire ordeal, which was that a person outside my family with actual authority had looked at the truth and the lie side by side and chosen the truth. My mom's response came flooding in through email, since I still had her number blocked. She wrote that I'd destroyed the family's reputation, that everyone would think they were scammers now, that I'd humiliated them in front of the entire community and gone out of my way to hurt them when all they'd ever done was try to help Delia. The messages got angrier and less coherent as they went, sentences breaking down into pure venom. My dad's messages were shorter and sadder, saying he couldn't believe I'd take it this far, that reporting them had gone beyond anything he could defend, that I was tearing the family apart over pride. I read them all once and then closed the laptop. The following Tuesday, the receptionist at my office called my desk and said someone was in the lobby asking for me. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I went down confused. My dad was standing near the entrance, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, his face tired and gray. He didn't try to come toward me when I came through the security door. He just walked over, handed handed me a thick envelope and left without a single word, walking out to the parking lot with his shoulders rounded. The envelope had my name on the front in his cramped handwriting. I took it upstairs and put it in my bag and didn't open it because I couldn't deal with whatever was inside in the middle of a workday. That night, I sat on my couch and pulled it out. 6 pages of legal pad, both sides, covered in my dad's handwriting. It was the closest thing to honesty I'd gotten from either of them. He admitted my mom had gone too far with the surgery plan. He wrote that she'd been so desperate to fix Delia's blindness that she'd convinced herself the ends justified the means, that once she'd committed to it, she couldn't back down. He wrote that he'd gone along with it because standing up to her had never once worked in 30 years of marriage, that keeping the peace with her was the only way he knew how to survive their life together. He said he knew I was angry, and he begged me to understand that everything came from love for Delia. He wrote about how helpless he'd felt watching her lose her sight, how the fake surgery had seemed, in some twisted moment, like a way to move me toward helping without ever grasping how wrong it was. He ended by saying he missed me, that he hoped one day I'd find my way back to the family, that he understood if I needed time but wanted me to know he loved me. I read it twice and then put it back in the envelope and cried for 20 minutes, not because it changed anything, but because it was so close to what I'd needed to hear and still so far from it. I brought the letter to my next session. Dr. Nasser read it carefully, all 6 pages, and then set it down and told me it was more honest than anything they'd said before, but that it was still fundamentally an excuse dressed as an apology. My dad had explained their behavior in detail, but had never once taken real responsibility for it, or acknowledged the specific harm it had done to me. He said he'd gone along with my mom's plan because standing up to her was too hard, which meant when you stripped it down that he'd chosen his own comfort over his son's body. The letter asked me to understand their motives, but offered to change nothing and to make no amends. Dr. Nasser helped me see that understanding why a person hurt you doesn't obligate you to keep letting them near you. You can have genuine compassion for someone's circumstances and still protect yourself from their behavior. My dad was trapped inside his own dysfunction, inside a marriage where disappearing was how he stayed safe, and none of that meant I had to stay trapped in there with him. 4 months after the meeting at my parents' house, I noticed I was sleeping through the night again every night. I could get through a full workday without my mind spinning off into family drama. I started making plans with friends on weekends instead of sitting home in the dark. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes, bracing for a new attack. The grief still came in waves, hitting me out of nowhere when I passed a father and son at a hardware store or heard a song from a childhood road trip, but it wasn't drowning me around the clock anymore. I was starting to be able to imagine a version of my life where I was okay without them, where their absence was just a fact about me instead of an open wound I kept reopening. I went to work, came home, saw friends, went to therapy, lived an ordinary life. Some days I barely thought about them at all. Delia's text came on a Wednesday afternoon. She said she was getting corneas from the transplant list within the next couple of months, that her surgery was scheduled for early the following month, and that she wanted me to know even though I clearly didn't care about her anymore. The message was built to make me feel guilty, a real piece of news with an accusation stapled to the end of it. I sat with my phone for a few minutes, and then I typed back that I was genuinely happy her surgery was scheduled and that I hoped it went smoothly and she recovered fully, and I meant every word of it. Whatever had happened between us, I had never once wanted her to stay blind. She read it right away and didn't respond. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to what I'd been doing. That Saturday, I met Desmond for coffee at the place near his apartment. We'd been doing this every couple of weeks since everything started, him checking in, me updating him on the latest family fallout, but this time felt different. I told him I thought I was ready to actually move forward with my life instead of just processing the past on a loop. He asked what that would look like, stirring his coffee, and as I answered, I realized I meant it, that I wanted to help other people caught in the same kind of family manipulation, maybe volunteer somewhere, maybe with the legal aid world Lorena worked in, maybe with a support group. I wanted to take everything I'd been forced to learn and turn it into something that made another person feel less alone than I had at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning. Desmond smiled and said that sounded exactly right, that turning the worst thing that ever happened to you into something useful was how people actually survived it. We spent the rest of the afternoon looking up volunteer opportunities and drafting an email to Lorena about how I could get involved. Lorena wrote back the following week with information about a family rights organization, along with a note that they were looking for volunteers for their support helpline. The training was 4 sessions, 2 hours each, covering how to recognize coercion tactics, what resources existed for people in crisis, and how to offer support without crossing boundaries. I sat in a conference room with 8 other volunteers listening to case studies that could have been transcripts of my own life. The facilitator talked about families who manufactured medical emergencies to control a member, about financial pressure, about the weaponization of guilt and obligation, and I filled pages of a notebook, underlining phrases that described my mother so precisely it was uncanny. During the 3rd session, we ran role-play scenarios of taking a call. I played the caller first, describing a situation where my brother needed a kidney and my parents were threatening to disown me if I didn't donate, and the volunteer playing the counselor validated what I was feeling and then asked simply about my own health and my own fears, and I started crying without meaning to. to, because in the entire cornea situation, not one member of my actual family had ever once asked how I felt about giving up an eye. The facilitator paused the exercise and quietly checked that I was okay, and I explained that this was more or less exactly what had happened to me, just with a cornea instead of a kidney. She nodded and said that was precisely why peer support worked, because we understood the shape of it from the inside. My first real shift on the helpline came 2 weeks after the training ended. I logged in from my apartment with a headset on, feeling absurdly nervous about talking to strangers about the worst days of their lives. The first call was someone asking about resources for elderly care, which I handled fine by reading off the resource sheet. The second call was a young woman named Bianca, whose voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand her at first. She explained that her family wanted her to drop out of college and move home to care for her grandmother full-time, and that her parents were telling her she was selfish for putting her own education over the woman who'd sacrificed everything for the family, that a good granddaughter would never dump her grandmother on paid strangers. Bianca kept saying maybe they were right, maybe she was being selfish, maybe she was a bad person for even wanting to stay in school, and I recognized every single move in it, because they were the exact moves that had been run on me for a decade. I told her that caring about her own future did not make her selfish, that she could love her grandmother deeply and still hold a boundary about her own life, that those two things were not in conflict, no matter how hard her family worked to make them feel that way. I told her that guilt is the favorite tool of a family that wants to control someone, and that real love does not require you to burn down your own future to prove it. I gave her information about family medical leave programs, about respite care, about caregiver support groups, about ways to stay connected to her grandmother without abandoning her own life. She cried, and then she thanked me, and she said nobody had ever told her it was allowed to want a life of her own. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment and cried too, because I was hearing myself say the words to her that I would have given almost anything to have someone say to me at 18, when I turned down a scholarship because my mother made wanting it feel like a crime. There was a strange doubling to it, a sense of being on both ends of the phone at once, the shaking 18-year-old and the steady voice he'd needed and never gotten, and I understood in that moment something about why people who've been through this end up doing this work. It isn't only altruism, it's a kind of time travel. Every time I told a caller that their perception was real and their boundary was allowed, some part of me was reaching back through the years to tell it to a younger version of myself who couldn't hear it then, and the telling landed in both places at once. Bianca called the helpline back a few weeks later on a different shift and left a message that got passed along to me, saying she'd applied for the family medical leave option instead of dropping out, that she'd told her parents she loved her grandmother and would help in ways that didn't require setting her own future on fire, and that they were furious, but she was still enrolled. She said she'd kept a sticky note on her laptop with something I'd said, that guilt is the favorite tool of a family that wants to control you, and that she read it every time she wavered. I sat with that message for a long time. I'd handed a stranger a single sentence, and she'd built a decision on it, the same way that man in my first support group meeting had handed me the sentence about holding a boundary the 40th time it's ignored. It was all just people passing along the words that had saved them, one to the next, a rope made of sentences, and I was holding a length of it now and reaching it down to whoever came after. There was a third call later that same shift, an older man whose adult kids had frozen him out after he refused to hand over his retirement savings to bail out one of them, and he kept asking whether he was a bad father for saying no, and I told him that a boundary is not the same thing as cruelty, that being unwilling to be exploited does not make you unloving. There was a fourth call that shift too, a short one, a woman who didn't really have a crisis so much as a question, who'd been fighting with her sister for years and wanted to know how you could tell the difference between a normal, difficult family and one that was actually doing you harm. It was the exact question I'd walked into Dr. Nasser's office asking, dressed in slightly different clothes, and I told her what I'd been told, that the line isn't about how much conflict there is, it's about what happens when you say no. A difficult family argues with your no and eventually respects it. A harmful one punishes you for having one, escalates until you take it back, makes the cost of the boundary so high that you learn never to draw one again. I told her only she could say which one hers was, but that if she genuinely couldn't remember the last time saying no had been allowed to stand, that was worth sitting with. She was quiet for a while, and then she thanked me and said she had some thinking to do and hung up. When the shift ended and I took the headset off, my apartment was dark and quiet, and I sat there for a long time feeling something settle in me, the sense that the thing that had nearly broken me might have a use, that it might be a set of eyes that could see something in someone else's fog and name it before it swallowed them. I drove to my appointment with Dr. Nasser the next afternoon, still thinking about Bianca and how trapped she'd sounded, how young. Dr. Nasser asked how the helpline work was going, and I told her about the calls, about recognizing myself in a stranger. She said that was both the hardest and the most healing part of peer support, watching your own pain play out in someone else's story, and getting to be, for them, the person nobody had been for you. We started talking about what a healthy relationship even looks like, and I admitted I genuinely didn't have a picture of one, because for as long as I could remember, love in my family had come with a bill attached. She pulled out a worksheet worksheet on relationship patterns, and we went through it line by line. Healthy love respects a boundary instead of punishing you for having one. It can hear the word no without retaliating. It supports your growth even when your growth is inconvenient for the other person. It doesn't keep a ledger of everything it's ever done for you and present the invoice the moment you disappoint it. Every item on that list was the photographic negative of how my parents had operated my entire life, and I felt a strange double thing: grief that I'd never had it and relief at finally seeing it written down clearly enough to reach for. She asked me to start noticing green flags in the people already around me, the small ways friends and coworkers showed care without any strings, and told me that learning to recognize safety was a skill I'd never been given the chance to build. I downloaded a dating app that weekend, partly because I was lonely and partly because I wanted to practice being a person with people who knew nothing about the wreckage of the last year. My profile was deliberately light, my job and a couple of hobbies, and nothing about any of it. I went on 3 dates over 2 weeks, all awkward in their own ways, but kind of wonderful too, because I got to just be a guy making small talk over coffee, a person with no history attached. The third was a woman named Corinne who worked in environmental policy and spent her weekends restoring an old canoe her grandfather had left her, and she was easy to talk to in a way that made an hour vanish. On our second date at a little Vietnamese place, she asked about my family in that ordinary way people do, and I felt my stomach tighten out of pure reflex. I gave her the line I'd been rehearsing with Dr. Nasser, that we weren't close and I didn't see them much. She just nodded and said that was fair, that families could be complicated, and then she asked what I'd wanted to be when I was a kid and moved us right along. The fact that she didn't push for the story, didn't try to diagnose or fix it, didn't tell me family is family and I should try harder, felt genuinely revolutionary, like proof that I could let someone in without my family becoming the center of the whole thing. I brought it up with Dr. Nasser at my next session, this small thing, a woman not pushing for a story, and she pointed out that I'd flagged it as remarkable precisely because I'd grown up in a world where everyone was always pushing for something, where no conversation was ever just a conversation, where interest in you was always a setup for a withdrawal from you. She said that learning to trust ease, to not brace for the catch inside a kindness, was going to be some of the hardest and most important work I did. Harder in some ways than leaving my family, because leaving was a single decision, and trusting was 1,000 small ones made over and over against an instinct that had kept me safe as a child and would only hurt me now. I thought about that a lot over the following weeks with Corinne, catching myself waiting for the invoice that never came, noticing the weight, setting it down. I sat in my car after that second date and realized I was smiling, and then I noticed I was already scanning the feeling for the trick in it, and I made myself stop, and I just let it be what it was, which was a good night with a person I liked. About 5 months had passed since the meeting at my parents' house when my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Renata. We'd been close as kids, the kind of cousins who spent whole summers together, and we'd drifted the way people do once adult life gets busy, but I'd always liked her. Her message said she'd been turning our last conversation over in her head, the one where she'd warned me about the mental breakdown story our parents were spreading, and that the more she'd sat with it, the less our parents' version of everything had held together for her. She said the story had never quite made sense, that too many pieces didn't line up, and the more she pulled at it, the more questions she had. She apologized for not reaching out sooner and asked if we could get coffee and actually talk. I stared at the message a long time, surprised by how much her believing me mattered, how starved I'd been for it without admitting it. I'd gotten so used to being the family villain, so used to accepting that most relatives would side with my parents by default, that having one person actually question the narrative felt like a gift I hadn't let myself hope for. I texted back suggesting a place halfway between us, and we set it for that Saturday. Renata was already there when I arrived, at a corner table with 2 coffees in front of her. She hugged me hard and immediately started apologizing for not questioning things sooner, for taking my parents' story at face value for as long as she had. I sat down and told her everything, and this time I had it all on my phone. Dr. Brennan's statement, the timeline, the screenshots. She read through it without interrupting, her face moving from confusion to something harder as the whole picture assembled in front of her. And then she started telling me things I'd never known. She talked about being pressured as a teenager to cover for my parents, to lie about where they'd been or why they'd missed something, to smooth over broken promises. She described watching my mom rearrange the truth of a situation whenever it threatened to make her look bad, always finding someone else to pin it on. She remembered specific family fights where she'd been forced to pick a side, where staying neutral wasn't allowed, where questioning my mom's version of events got you frozen out cold. She said that watching me hold a boundary this year had given her permission to look honestly at her own relationship with them, to finally name patterns she'd been talking herself out of seeing for most of her life. We talked for 3 hours, our coffees going cold, the cafe filling up and emptying out around us. At one point, Renata mentioned that Delia's transplant surgery had actually happened 2 weeks earlier, and that it had gone well, that Delia was regaining her vision gradually and doing therapy to adjust to seeing again. And Renata said she was genuinely happy for her, and so was I. A clean, simple relief with nothing complicated attached. Then she added the part that made my jaw tighten, which was that my parents were now telling people the surgery had been paid for thanks to the fundraiser, the one that had been shut down for fraud, still spinning a story to make themselves the heroes. They could not admit they'd been caught. They could not admit that the transplant had come through the normal waiting list, exactly the way Dr. Brennan had said it would from the very beginning, with nothing my parents did having helped at all. Delia could see again, and they were still rewriting history to avoid saying they'd been wrong. Renata told me one other thing before we left the cafe that afternoon, something that stayed with me. She said that watching how I'd handled the whole thing, the documentation, the boundaries, the refusal to be dragged into a screaming match on their terms, had changed how she saw her own situation, and that she'd started therapy herself a couple of months earlier because of it. She said she'd spent her whole life being the family peacekeeper, the one who smoothed everything over, the one who absorbed tension so nobody else had to, and that she'd never once questioned whether that job was fair to her until she watched me put it down. She laughed a little and said I'd ruined a perfectly good lifetime of denial for her, and then she got serious and said thank you, and that she meant it. It was a strange thing to sit with, the idea that just by refusing to disappear I'd given someone else permission to stop disappearing too, that a boundary held in private could ripple outward to people I'd never expected it to reach. I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot and drove home turning it over, understanding for the first time that the thing I'd done to survive might also, without my intending it, be a thing other people could use as a map. At my next session, Dr. Nasser asked if I'd be willing to try writing a letter to my parents that I would never send, purely to get everything out of me and onto a page. I'd resisted the idea before, thinking it was pointless to write to people who'd never read it, but something had shifted after the afternoon with Renata, some last thread of hope quietly going slack. I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop and started, and it poured out of me. The letter grew to 10 pages, single-spaced, everything I'd never been able to say. I wrote about the childhood I'd deserved, one where my needs counted as much as Delia's, where I wasn't just the healthy son who existed as a resource for my sister. I wrote about the relationship we could have had if they'd ever been capable of plain honesty and basic respect. I listed specific memories, the scholarship, the inheritance, the job offer, the car, all the times I'd been quietly overwritten and had called it love. I wrote that the cornea scheme wasn't a one-time act of desperation, but the final proof of a pattern that had run my entire life. The day they finally asked for a piece of my body because they'd already gotten everything else, and I'd always said yes. I told them about the damage, about the therapy I needed to undo their conditioning, about the family I'd had to lose because they chose the story over the truth every single time. I cried the whole way through it, tears dropping onto the keys, my chest aching for parents who had never really existed and never would. I brought the printed pages to Desmond's apartment the following weekend. He'd offered to help me with what Dr. Nasser called a closing ritual, something physical to mark the end of hoping they would ever understand or change. He had a fire going in the little fireplace in his living room, and I stood there holding those 10 pages, feeling the weight of every word on them. He asked if I wanted to read any of it out loud, and I shook my head and just started feeding the pages into the flames one at a time. They curled and blackened, and my words went up as smoke, and something about watching them burn felt like finally releasing the fantasy that my parents would ever become the people I'd needed them to be, accepting that closure was going to have to come from inside me instead of from an apology that was never coming. Desmond stood next to me until the last page was gone, and then he handed me a beer, and we sat on his couch not talking, just sitting in the quiet fact that some things cannot be fixed, and that surviving them is its own kind of victory. Work called me into a meeting the following Tuesday, and I assumed it was about the Ridgeline project I'd been leading. Instead, my manager Denise told me they were promoting me to senior coordinator, with more responsibility and a real pay increase. She said I'd been doing excellent work, that I'd shown leadership on hard projects, even when it was clear I had a lot on my plate personally, and that they wanted to invest in my growth with the company. I sat there absorbing it, realizing with a strange jolt that I was actually in a place to accept it. 6 months earlier, I'd been barely functional, standing in bathroom stalls waiting for my hands to stop shaking, unable to hold a thought that wasn't about my family. Now I was thriving, doing the best work of my career, ready to take on more. I accepted the promotion and thanked Denise, and that night I took myself out to a good Italian place downtown and sat at a table by the window and ordered a glass of wine and pasta and a slice of tiramisu, and I ate alone and felt genuinely proud. Proud of having built a life my family couldn't reach in to touch or diminish, a thing that was entirely mine. I thought about calling someone to tell them, and I realized I had a whole list of people I actually could call now, which was maybe the real thing worth celebrating. And I noticed, sitting there with my wine and my tiramisu, an absence that had quietly become a presence, which was that not once during the whole promotion conversation had I thought about how to frame it for my parents, how to present it so my mom wouldn't find a way to make it smaller, how to share good news in a house where good news for me had always somehow needed to be managed. For as long as I could remember, every win had come with a second job stapled to it, the job of protecting the win from the people who were supposed to be happiest about it. My mom had a particular talent for it, a way of receiving anything good that happened to me and handing it back slightly diminished. A congratulations accusations with a hook in it. But have you thought about, well, I hope you don't forget where you came from. I'd gotten so used to it that I'd stopped noticing I did the protecting at all, that I pre-managed my own achievements out of reflex before they ever reached her. And now, there was no one to manage. My good news could just be good news. I could sit in a restaurant and feel plainly proud of a thing I'd earned, with nothing lying in wait to shrink it, and the simple, uncomplicated fullness of that was almost unfamiliar enough to be disorienting. I called Desmond from the table, and he was loud and delighted and made me repeat the part about the raise twice, and there was no hook in it anywhere, just a friend glad for me. And I sat there in the warm noise of the restaurant and let myself have it. The estrangement support group met on Tuesday evenings in the basement of a community center that smelled permanently of old coffee and floor wax. At first, I'd gone because Dr. Nasser said it would help, the way you take a medicine you don't quite believe in. But somewhere around the 6th or 7th week, it stopped feeling like homework and started feeling like the one place I could exhale all the way. There were 8 or 9 of us who came regularly, all of us dealing with different flavors of the same thing, and 2 people in particular became mine. Nadia had been estranged from her parents for 4 years after they tried to force her into a marriage she hadn't agreed to, and she had a dry, brutal sense of humor that could cut a guilt spiral off at the knees in one sentence. Pilar had been cut off by her family for being gay, and had built from scratch the warmest chosen family I'd ever seen, and watching her do it gave me a picture of what was possible. We started getting coffee after meetings, then dinner, then movies on weekends, then the constant low hum of texts about nothing, a dumb meme, a bad date, a small win. They understood something my other friends couldn't quite reach, the specific grief of mourning a family that was technically still alive, of missing people who were still out there choosing not to be who you needed. Nadia said once that we were the island of misfit toys, and it stuck. And it was the first time in my adult life I felt like I had siblings who actually showed up, who called back, who remembered the things I told them. My phone buzzed during lunch at work a few weeks later, with a message from a number I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be my Aunt Rhonda. Her text was short and careful. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking since that awful day at my parents' house, and that she'd come to realize my parents had manipulated her too, that they'd fed her their version of events and used her presence in that living room to add weight to the pressure on me. She wrote that she wasn't asking for forgiveness or a relationship, that she didn't expect either. She just wanted me to know that she saw the truth of it now, and that she was sorry for the part she'd played, sorry for the things she'd said about being grateful and being decent when I was the only person in that room telling the truth. The message ended with her saying she hoped I was doing well, and that she'd understand completely if I never wanted to hear from her again. I stared at my phone for a long time, feeling something shift and loosen in my chest. It wasn't absolution and it wasn't a reunion, but it was an acknowledgement, an actual one, the first honest sentence to reach me from anyone who'd been in that room, and it landed heavier than I'd expected. I texted back a simple thank you for telling me, and we left it there. No demands, no plans, no expectations, just one piece of honesty finally breaking through the fog, and somehow that was enough to matter. October rolled into November, and my cousin Dahlia called and asked if I wanted to come to Thanksgiving at her place. She said she'd invited a handful of relatives who were quietly tired of my parents' drama and wanted at least one holiday without all the tension and the sides and the performance. She said, a little carefully, that she'd been one of the people who believed the story at first, and that she was sorry, and that she'd read the email I sent with the doctor's statement more times than she wanted to admit before it finally sank in. I was nervous about saying yes, worried it would be awkward, worried someone would bring up the whole mess over the turkey, but I also missed having family that felt like family, the ordinary kind, and I said yes. Dahlia's apartment was small and packed. 7 of us crammed elbow to elbow around a table meant for 4, and the day turned out to be one of the easiest I'd had in a year. We ate too much and argued about football and played a board game that ended in accusations of cheating, and not one person mentioned my parents or Delia or corneas or any of it. My uncle, a different uncle than the one who'd gotten angry at me, asked about my promotion and then actually listened to the answer, asked follow-up questions, seemed proud. Dahlia's 2 kids showed me their leftover Halloween candy and tried to teach me a dance from some app that I was catastrophically bad at, and everyone laughed at me, and it was the good kind of laughing. When I left that evening, hugging people at the door and promising to come to Dahlia's holiday thing in December, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was that I could have family without having my parents. The two weren't the same thing. I didn't have to lose one to protect myself from the other. That realization sat with me the whole drive home, quiet and steadying, like a floor I hadn't known was under me. Corinne and I had been seeing each other for a couple of months by then, and it had grown into something steady in a way I kept expecting to spook me and somehow didn't. She was patient in a way I wasn't used to, never pushing, never keeping score, and slowly I found myself telling her more. One night at her place, over takeout, I told her a fuller version of the family situation. Not everything, but enough. The fake surgery, the pressure, the no contact. She listened all the way through without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't try to fix it or tell me family was family or ask if I'd considered that they meant well. She just said that sounded like it had taken enormous strength to walk away from, and asked what she could do to make things easier when it came up. I sat there feeling something warm move through my chest, because that was the whole thing, wasn't it? A person who asked what I needed instead of telling me what I should feel. I introduced her to my people not long after, brought her to a dinner with Desmond and Nadia and Pilar, and I watched her fit into that table like she'd always had a chair there, laughing at Nadia's terrible jokes, asking Pilar real questions about the community garden she ran. On the drive home, Corinne said she liked my friends, and then, after a pause, she said she could tell how much they loved me, and that it told her everything she needed to know about who I actually was, no matter what my parents were telling people. I had to look out the window for a second so she wouldn't see my face. It was maybe a month after that when Corinne asked, gently, over a movie neither of us was really watching, whether I'd ever want her to meet my family. She asked it casually, like it was just the natural next step people take. I paused the movie and turned to face her, my heart picking up, and I told her the truth. I told her I was estranged from my parents and that it was permanent. Not a rough patch, not a fight we'd get over, but a decision I'd made to protect myself from people who could not be honest or respectful, and that I didn't see it ever changing. I braced for her to get weird about it, to suggest I was being extreme, to say the thing everyone eventually says about how you only get one family. Instead, she asked me what I needed from her about it. Did I want her to just never bring them up? Was I okay talking about it sometimes? Did I need her to run interference if they ever tried to reach her or turned up somewhere? She laid the options out plainly and then waited, and I sat there with that warmth spreading through me again, because this was what healthy looked like. Someone who respected the boundary without trying to renegotiate it, who asked what I needed instead of informing me what I should do. I leaned over and kissed her and told her I might need support sometimes, but that mostly I just needed her to accept it as part of the truth of me, and she said that was easy, that she could do that. And we went back to the movie with my arm around her, and for the first time in my life I understood that being loved didn't have to cost me anything. Around that same time, the family rights organization asked whether I'd be willing to help facilitate a new support group they were starting for young adults dealing with manipulation and coercion. I said yes before I'd really thought it through, and then spent a week quietly panicking about whether I was remotely qualified, whether I was too close to my own situation, whether I'd freeze up. But at the first meeting, sitting in a circle of 8 nervous people barely out of college, I realized I was good at this. I could spot the tactics as they came out of people's mouths, because I'd lived every one of them. When a young woman described her mother's guilt trips, I knew the exact texture of them. When a guy talked about feeling like he was going insane because his family's version of events never matched his own memory, I could tell him with total certainty that his perception was trustworthy, that being made to doubt your own memory was the whole point of what had been done to him. I handed out practical resources and helped people script boundaries and reminded them over and over that protecting themselves did not make them selfish, that the word selfish was a leash and they were allowed to slip it. Turning the worst thing that had ever happened to me into something that helped a room full of strangers felt like a kind of alchemy. Poison run through some process I didn't fully understand, and coming out the other side is medicine. After each meeting, I drove home tired in a way that felt clean, emptied out and refilled at the same time, like I'd found a use for the wreckage. There was one guy in that group, maybe 22, who reminded me so much of myself that it was hard to look at him some weeks. His older sister had a chronic illness, and his whole family had organized itself around her the way mine had around Delia, and he'd spent his entire life being told that any need of his own was a betrayal of her. He came in the first few weeks convinced he was a bad brother for even being in the room, and week by week I watched him start to straighten up, start to use words like boundary and enmeshment without flinching, start to believe that loving his sister and having a self were not mutually exclusive. The night he told the group he'd finally said no to something, a small thing, a weekend he'd wanted for himself that his family had tried to claim, and that the sky hadn't fallen, I had to excuse myself for a minute in the hallway, because I was watching someone climb out of the exact hole I'd spent a year climbing out of, and getting there faster because someone was reaching down. That was the night I understood, all the way down, that the thing my family had done to me was not the end of my story. It was the raw material of it. I started apartment hunting in March, scrolling listings on my lunch breaks and letting myself imagine a place that felt like mine instead of just somewhere I slept. My lease was up in a couple of months, and I wanted something bigger, somewhere I could have people over without everyone standing in the kitchen, somewhere I could paint the walls a color if I wanted, without asking anyone for permission. I found a 1-bedroom with old hardwood floors and big south-facing windows in a neighborhood I'd always liked, 20 minutes from work and a short walk from the coffee place near where my support group met. The rent was higher than what I'd been paying, but the promotion covered it, and signing that lease felt like planting a flag in ground that belonged to me. When I filled out the change of address forms at the post office, I deliberately left my parents off every list. The physical distance matched the distance I'd built inside, 4 hours of highway, plus an address they would simply never have. Moving day was hot and loud and chaotic in the best way. Desmond and Corinne and Nadia and Pilar and Marisol from my support group all showing up with their cars and their questionable lifting technique. We turned unpacking into a pizza party, sitting on the new couch eating out of the box while Marisol hung curtains she'd insisted on buying me, and Corinne assembled a bookshelf with Desmond reading the instructions upside down on purpose to annoy her. The apartment filled up with laughter and stupid inside jokes and the sound of people who showed up when they said they would, and somewhere in the middle of it I stopped and looked around and understood that this was what home was supposed to feel like. Not the house I grew up in, where love was always a transaction and I was always somehow in debt, but this, a space I'd chosen, full of people who valued me without conditions and without an invoice. 1 year after the confrontation, I pitched an essay to an online magazine that ran personal narratives about family and estrangement. I used a pen name, Julian Hart, to protect my privacy and Delia's, but I wrote about all of it: the fabricated surgery, the manipulation tactics laid out one by one, the slow, brutal work of breaking free and rebuilding. I wrote it plainly, without villains twirling mustaches, because the truth was scarier than any cartoon. The truth was that these were ordinary people who loved in a way that consumed rather than nourished, and that the ordinariness was exactly what made it so hard to see from the inside. The editor accepted it within a week, and seeing my own words go live under a name that wasn't mine made the whole nightmare feel like it had finally turned into something with a purpose beyond just being a thing that had happened to me. The piece went up on a Tuesday morning, and by that evening the comment section had hundreds of responses. People poured out their own stories: family coercion, manufactured medical emergencies, being pressured to sacrifice their bodies or their futures or their savings for a relative whose needs had been declared bottomless. Someone wrote that their mother had tried to guilt them into donating part of their liver using nearly identical tactics. Someone else described a family that had lied about a sibling's cancer diagnosis to extract money for years. A man wrote that he'd given a kidney at 19 under exactly this kind of pressure and had spent 2 decades being reminded of the debt he'd supposedly created by needing anything for himself afterward. I read through them with my throat tight, both amazed and sick at how many families ran on this same machinery. How many people had been made to feel like criminals for having boundaries about their own bodies. How many had assumed, the way I had for years, that this was just what family was. A few of them wrote that reading it was the first time they'd understood their own situation had a name. One woman wrote that she'd sent it to her therapist. Another wrote simply that she was going to call the doctor herself tomorrow, and I sat and looked at that comment for a long time. It was maybe 2 weeks later, in late December, that my phone lit up with a text from Delia. It was a photo of her, smiling at the camera, her eyes clear and focused and looking right into the lens, and the message under it just said, "I can see again." My heart did something complicated, happy and grieving and relieved all at once, tangled up in a way I couldn't neatly separate. I typed back that I was genuinely glad, that I was so happy the surgery had worked, and I meant it completely. She wrote back a thank you and asked how I was doing, and we had a short, careful exchange that was cordial and distant, the conversation of two people who share a history and not much else anymore. She didn't apologize for the lies or acknowledge what had happened in that living room, and I didn't push her to. Maybe someday we'd have some version of a relationship, something honest and bounded and real, built on ground that didn't shift every time I asked a direct question. But I wasn't holding my breath and I wasn't waiting for it, and I'd stopped needing her to be different in order for me to be okay. For now, cordial was more than we'd had in a year, and I let it be what it was. The Christmas card arrived 3 days before the holiday, forwarded from my old address because I'd never given them the new one. It had a generic snowy scene on the front, and inside, in my mom's handwriting, it said only, "Thinking of you this special season," with both their signatures underneath. No acknowledgement of the last year, no apology, no reference to any of it. Just a cheerful little card, as if we were a normal family that had simply drifted out of touch and might drift back in over eggnog. I brought it to my next session, and Dr. Nasser and I talked about what it actually was. She said this was a test, a soft one, to see whether I'd quietly agree to sweep the entire thing under the rug if they just behaved as though it had never happened, whether I'd accept an easy path back into the family fold in exchange for pretending. She pointed out that responding to it at all, even warmly, even to say something neutral, would tell them that pretending worked, that they could lie and manipulate and try to take an eye, and then simply reset the relationship on their own terms without ever once taking responsibility. I thought about the years I'd spent doing exactly that, absorbing and smoothing and pretending to keep the peace. I threw the card in my kitchen trash that night and didn't send anything back. The silence I chose felt like its own kind of answer, the clearest sentence I'd ever spoken to them. The essay found its way back to my family in January, the way these things do. Someone, I never found out exactly who, recognized enough of the details to be sure it was me, pen name or not, and forwarded it around. My mom's response came, as it always did now, through email, since her number was still blocked. She wrote that I had crossed a line I could never uncross, that airing our private family business to strangers on the internet was an act of pure malice, that I had branded my own parents as monsters for the entertainment of people who didn't know us. She threatened again to sue, said she'd been talking to a lawyer, said I'd defamed them in a way that had cost them friendships and standing in the community. The messages had the same escalating, unspooling quality as always, starting controlled and ending in a place that barely held together as sentences. A year year earlier, those emails would have put me on the floor. This time, I read them once, forwarded them to Lorena out of habit, and made myself a sandwich. Lorena called the next day and told me what she'd told me before, that the essay named no one, identified no one, used a false name and altered details, and stated nothing that wasn't documented and true, and that a defamation suit over it would be laughed out of any office my mother walked it into. She said almost gently that the repeated threats to sue were themselves a tell, that people confident in their own version of events don't need to keep threatening to punish you for telling yours. I thanked her and hung up and realized, sitting there, that the emails hadn't cost me a single hour of sleep, and that the not caring was its own quiet milestone, a thing I could never have imagined a year before. And then something I hadn't expected happened underneath all that noise. The essay, forwarded around to shame me, did the opposite with a handful of relatives who read it all the way through. A great aunt I'd barely spoken to since childhood wrote me a long, careful email saying she'd read it twice, and that it had unlocked something she'd spent 40 years not letting herself understand about her own sister, my grandmother, and about the way our whole family had always run on guilt and silence. A cousin on my dad's side called and, in a halting, uncomfortable way, apologized for a thing he'd said about me at a wedding 2 years earlier, said he finally understood he'd been repeating a story he'd never checked. It was the strangest thing. Watching the exact weapon meant to isolate me instead pull a few more people quietly toward the truth. Not many. Most of the family stayed where it was, in the comfortable version where I was the problem. But a few more lights came on, and I stopped needing all of them to. In February, the family rights organization sent me an unexpected email. They were expanding their board of directors and wanted to know if I'd be interested in a seat. The role would involve strategic planning, fundraising, and helping shape the programs the organization ran for people living through family trauma and coercion. Reading it, I felt something I could only describe as a new identity clicking into place. Not just someone who had survived family manipulation, but someone who had decided to spend a real part of his life dismantling it for other people. My story had a purpose now that reached past me, a map I could hand to somebody still lost in the woods I'd finally walked out of. I filled out the application that same night, and the acceptance call came 2 weeks later. At my first board meeting, going around the table introducing myself to the other directors, I felt like I'd found my people in a completely different register than the support group. Not people processing the wound, but people who'd turned theirs into a lever and were using it to move something. One of the other new directors, a woman about my mom's age, told me during a break that she'd donated a kidney to a sibling at 26 under pressure, exactly like what the organization existed to fight, and that she'd spent the next 15 years being told she owed the family for the privilege of it, and that the day she finally walked away was the day her real life had started. She said it plainly without drama, stirring bad conference room coffee, and I thought about the man in my very first support group meeting, the kidney and the manufactured emergency, and I understood that I'd wandered into an entire quiet nation of people who'd been asked for pieces of themselves and had finally learned to say no. My work on the helpline kept going the whole time, 1 or 2 shifts a week, and the calls stacked up into something like a second education. There was a woman whose in-laws were pressuring her to give up her career to raise a nephew, a teenager terrified of coming out to parents who'd made loyalty conditional, a man in his 60s being frozen out for refusing to co-sign a loan that would have wiped out his retirement. Every call was different, and every call was somehow the same machinery of guilt and obligation and manufactured urgency, the same voice on the other end asking some version of the question I'd asked Dr. Nasser in our first session, am I crazy? Am I the bad person here? And every time I got to be the voice saying, no, you're not. Your perception is real. You're allowed to protect yourself. There was one call, late on a weeknight, from a young man whose family wanted him to donate bone marrow to a cousin, framing it as a life or death emergency with no time to think, and something in his rushed, panicked voice was so familiar that I had to steady my own breathing before I could speak. I walked him through slowing down, through asking to speak to the actual doctor, through the difference between real urgency and manufactured urgency. He called back a week later, which callers almost never do, and left a message with the after-hours line saying he'd talked to the cousin's doctor, that the situation was real, but nowhere near as urgent as his family had made it sound, that he'd agreed to be tested on his own terms and his own timeline instead of theirs, and that for the first time in his life, he felt like he was making the choice rather than being marched into it. He thanked me by the name I'd given on the call, which wasn't my real one, and I sat in my quiet apartment afterward and felt the whole arc of the last year fold in on itself, because a stranger had done in a week, with one steadying voice, what had taken me a decade and a half my sanity to do alone. Desmond came over for dinner in February and told me, out of nowhere, that he was proud of how far I'd come. We were eating takeout on my new couch, and he just said it, looking at me with an expression that was fond and a little amazed, the look of someone who'd watched the whole thing happen up close and still couldn't quite believe the distance covered. And sitting there, I realized I was proud of myself too, which was not a sentence I'd have been capable of a year before. I'd trusted my own perception when my entire family stood in a room and told me I was wrong. I'd held a boundary through months of pressure and guilt and threats and a lawyer's letter and a fraudulent fundraiser and a whole extended family repeating a story about me that wasn't wasn't true. I'd built a support system out of nothing, found a therapist, joined groups, made friends who actually showed up, fallen for someone kind. I was, by any measure I could think of, genuinely happy in my daily life, doing work I cared about and helping people who needed exactly what I'd once needed, and dating someone who made me feel safe, and eating Thanksgiving with cousins who respected me. The family I'd been born into didn't define me anymore. They were people I used to know who had made a choice I couldn't accept, and I had made the choice to build something better without them, and both of those were just facts now, not open wounds. Corinne and I passed 6 months together in the spring, and somewhere in there she asked if I wanted to come with her to her parents' place for a weekend, and I said yes, and I spent 2 days inside a version of family I'd only ever read about on the helpline resource sheets. Her parents bickered about the thermostat and asked me about my job and didn't keep a ledger of anything. Her dad taught me the disaster of a grilling technique he swore by. Her mom sent us home with more leftovers than 2 people could eat in a week. Nobody performed anything. Nobody needed anything from me except that I passed the salad. On the drive home, Corinne asked, a little nervously, whether it had been weird for me, being around a family like that after everything, and I told her the truth, that it hadn't been weird. It had been like getting to stand in a room and finally see, from the outside, the shape of the thing I'd never had, and that instead of making me bitter, it had made me certain that the picture I'd built with Dr. Nasser of what healthy looked like wasn't a fantasy, that it existed, that people really lived inside it. Corinne reached over and took my hand at a red light and didn't say anything, and I understood that I was building my way toward it, one steady choice at a time. My birthday came in the middle of all of it, the first one since going no contact. In every year I could remember, my birthday had come with a phone call from my mom that was really about her, about how hard she'd labored, about how much she'd given up, a card with a check in it that always seemed to arrive with strings I couldn't see until later. This year there was no call, and for about an hour that morning the silence had teeth. Then Desmond and Corinne and Nadia and Pilar took me out to a loud restaurant with terrible acoustics and good food, and my phone lit up all day with messages from people who'd chosen to be in my life, and Ruben brought a genuinely ugly grocery store cake into the office and made the whole team sing off key, and by the end of the day I realized the silence from my parents hadn't had teeth at all, that I'd only expected it to out of habit. A birthday, it turned out, could just be a day people who loved you were glad you'd been born, with nothing owed and no invoice at the bottom. I saw my mom once, that spring, by accident. I was picking up a prescription at a pharmacy 2 towns over from where I lived, somewhere I had no reason to be except that Corinne's dentist was nearby, and I'd offered to run an errand, and I turned down an aisle, and there she was, 30 feet away, reading the back of a box of something under the fluorescent lights. My whole body went cold and then hot. For a second, every instinct I'd been unlearning for a year screamed at once, the urge to go over, to smooth it, to make her not be angry at me, the old reflex to manage her feelings before I'd even registered my own. I stood at the end of the aisle and watched her not see me, and I waited to feel the pull to close the distance, and it came, and then, for the first time in my life, it passed. I looked at her, this small, tired woman squinting at a box, a person who had once arranged an entire room of family to convince me to give up an eye based on a lie, and I felt something I hadn't expected, which was not hatred and not longing, but a kind of clear, level sadness, the way you feel looking at a house you used to live in that's been let go to ruin. I turned around and walked to the front of the store and paid for my prescription and left, and I did not look back, and my hands were steady the whole time. I sat in my car in the lot for a minute afterward, half waiting to fall apart, and I didn't. I called Corinne and told her what had happened, and she asked if I was okay, and I realized I actually was, that I'd stood 10 seconds from the person who'd nearly broken me and had simply chosen to keep my own life instead of walking back into hers. Dr. Nasser told me later that the moment I described, the pull that came and then passed, was the whole thing. The entire year of work compressed into a single aisle, the difference between a wound that still runs you and a scar you can carry. Not long after that, an old family friend reached out, a woman named Colette who'd known my family since before I was born and had been at half my childhood birthdays. She sent a message saying she'd heard some version of what had happened and that she'd finally gotten the courage to ask around and piece the real story together, and that she owed me an apology for a lifetime of watching my family treat me as the spare one, the reliable one, the one whose job was to absorb, and never once saying anything. She said she'd told herself it wasn't her place, that families were private, and that she saw now how that silence had helped hold the whole thing in place. It was a strange kind of grief to receive, an adult admitting she'd watched it happen to a child and looked away, but there was something in the honesty of it that mattered, and I told her so. She asked if she could take me to lunch. No agenda, just to see the person I'd grown into, and I said yes, and it was easy, and she cried a little over her soup, and I found I'd stopped being surprised by how many people had spent years quietly seeing the truth and saying nothing, and how much it meant when even one of them finally said it out loud. The organization asked me that summer to tell my story at a small evening event they held for donors and volunteers, 10 minutes up front in my own words. I almost said no. Standing in front of a room to describe the worst year of my life felt like a different order of exposure than a support group circle or a pen name on a website, but I said yes, this, and I wrote it out and cut it down and practiced it on Corinne until I could get through it without my voice going. And on the night I stood up under the lights and told a room full of strangers about the meeting, the demand, the fake surgery, the phone call to Dr. Brennan, the long climb out, I kept it plain. I didn't reach for sympathy. And when I finished, there was a silence and then applause. And afterward, a line of people waited to talk to me. And one by one, they told me pieces of their own stories. A man whose father had pressured him to give a lobe of his liver. A woman who'd handed over her entire savings to keep a sibling out of trouble and been called selfish when she finally stopped. A young person who just gripped my hand and couldn't get any words out at all and didn't need to. One woman near the back waited until almost everyone was gone, and then she told me, quietly, that she'd come tonight with her checkbook and a plan to write a small donation, and that instead she was going to go home and finally call the brother she hadn't spoken to since he'd taken their parents' side in something exactly like this, and tell him she understood now what had been done to both of them. I drove home that night lighter than I'd been in years, understanding that the thing my family had tried to use to hollow me out had become, somehow, the most useful thing about me. My cousin Dahlia called me in April with news that surprised me. She said Delia had started seeing a therapist, someone who specialized in disability adjustment and in family systems, and that, from what Dahlia could tell, Delia had begun, slowly, to look at her own part in what had happened. Dahlia said Delia had mentioned me in one of their recent conversations, had said out loud that the surgery scheme had been wrong, that she should have questioned it instead of sitting silent, that she'd let herself be carried along because it was easier than facing our parents. I felt something cautious and complicated hearing it, not quite hope, but the distant outline of where hope might one day stand. I wasn't ready to reach out, and I wasn't sure I ever would be, and I'd made my peace with not knowing which. But knowing Delia was doing the work, that she was at least turning to look at the thing instead of away from it, made a future version of some relationship feel possible without being required. Maybe someday we'd sit across a table and talk about what actually happened in that living room, honestly, both of us. Maybe we'd find some small, true version of being a brother and sister that didn't run on guilt. But I didn't need that to be okay anymore, and I didn't need her understanding to validate the choices I'd made. And there was a freedom in that I hadn't had a year before, when her approval had felt like oxygen. A few weeks later, Delia texted me herself, and it was different from the coached message she'd sent me a year earlier. It was shorter, and there was no frame around it, no context designed to shift the weight onto her suffering. She wrote that she'd been thinking about me in therapy, that she was starting to understand things she hadn't been able to see before, and that she owed me an apology she wasn't ready to give properly yet, but wanted me to know was coming. She wrote that she'd sat in that room and let them say things she'd known weren't right, that she'd been so afraid and so desperate that she'd let herself be a part of hurting me, and that she was sorry, even if sorry wasn't nearly enough. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't ask me to come back, didn't ask me to forgive her, didn't wrap it in a request. It was the first message from anyone in my immediate family that was just an acknowledgement, offered with nothing attached. I read it several times, and I didn't feel the rush of relief or the collapse of the wall I might have expected a year before. I felt careful. I'd learned too much to mistake one honest text for a changed person, or to let my longing for a sister do the work my judgment was supposed to do. I wrote back that I appreciated her saying it, that it mattered more than she probably knew, and that I wasn't ready for more than that yet, and that I hoped her recovery was going well. I meant all of it. Dr. Nasser and I spent a whole session on that exchange, on the difference between keeping a door unlocked and flinging it open, on how I could let Delia's honesty be real and still move at the speed my own safety required, rather than the speed her guilt or my hope wanted. She said the healthiest thing I could do was exactly what I'd done: receive it without rushing toward it, let time and consistency do the proving that words alone never could. It was maybe a month after that when the pressure came, the way I'd half known it eventually would. A relative I hadn't heard from in the whole ordeal called to tell me my mom wasn't doing well, that she'd been having health problems, that the stress of the last year had aged her, and that maybe it was time for me to be the bigger person, to reach out, to let bygones be bygones before it was too late, and I had regrets I couldn't fix. The call was gentle and reasonable on its surface, and I recognized the shape of it instantly, because it was the same shape as everything: the manufactured urgency, the ticking clock, the framing of my boundary as a cruelty I'd have to answer for someday. A year earlier it would have worked. A year earlier the word regret would have gotten into me and grown. This time I listened, and I said I was sorry to hear my mom wasn't well, and I meant that in the plain human way you mean it about anyone. And then I said that my not being in contact wasn't punishment and wasn't spite, that it was the only way I'd found to be safe, and that a health problem, real or exaggerated, didn't change what had been done or undo the fact that no one had ever taken responsibility for it. I said I wished her well, and that I hoped she recovered, and that I wasn't going to reopen a door to people who'd tried to talk me out of an eye and had never once said they were sorry. The relative went quiet, and then said she understood, in a tone that told me she didn't, and we hung up. I sat with it, waiting for the guilt to rise the way it always used to. It came, a familiar shadow of it, and then it passed, because I'd finally learned the difference between guilt, that means you've done something wrong, and guilt that just means you've stopped doing what someone trained you to do. My dad reached out one more time in early summer, an email this time. Not through my mom's channels, but on his own. It was different from the 6 pages he'd handed me in that lobby the year before. Shorter, quieter, less of the reflexive defense of my mom that had run through everything he'd ever said. He wrote that he'd been doing some thinking on his own, away from her, which he admitted he'd almost never done in his life. He said he could see now that he'd spent 30 years choosing the path of least resistance and calling it keeping the peace, and that the person who'd paid for that peace over and over had been me. He said he didn't expect that to fix anything. He said he wasn't asking me to come back, that he understood he'd lost the right to ask for things. He just wanted me to know that he saw it, finally, that he'd failed me not in one dramatic moment but in 1,000 small surrenders across my whole childhood, and that he was sorry. It was, of everything either of them had ever sent me, the closest thing to a real apology I'd received, and I sat with it for a long time. I brought it to Dr. Nasser, and we talked about how to hold it, because it was more than my dad had ever managed, and still not a foundation you could rebuild a relationship on. Not while he still lived inside the same marriage and the same house, still deferring to the same person, still, when it came down to it, unwilling to actually change anything about his life. She helped me see that I could believe his sorrow was real and still not owe him my return, that an apology is a gift and not a bill, that receiving it did not obligate me to hand back everything I'd fought to build. I wrote him a short reply. I told him I believed he was sorry, and that it meant something to hear it, and that I wasn't able to be in contact right now, maybe not for a long time, and that I hoped he'd keep doing the thinking he'd started, for his own sake if not for mine. I didn't slam the door. I just didn't walk through it. And that, Dr. Nasser said, was its own kind of health, the ability to leave a door unlocked without feeling obligated to stand in the frame waiting. That spring I got to be, for once, the person on the other side of the phone. Nadia called me late on a Thursday, her voice thin in a way I'd never heard from her, and told me her family had reached out for the first time in years, that a cousin's wedding was coming and they wanted her there, and that the old machinery had started up inside her instantly. The guilt, the longing, the voice that said maybe it would be different this time, maybe she was the one being stubborn, and I got to do for her exactly what she and Pilar had done for me 100 times, to sit on the phone at 11 at night and remind her gently and without judgment of everything she already knew but couldn't hold on to in that moment, that a single invitation was not a changed family, that hope was not evidence, that she was allowed to grieve the family she wished she had without walking back into the one she actually had. We talked for 2 hours. By the end, she was steadier, and she thanked me, and I told her she'd earned the right to lean on someone for once, that the whole point of what we'd built was that it went both ways. Hanging up, I understood something about the chosen family I'd assembled that I hadn't fully grasped before, which was that it wasn't just a place to be caught. It was a place to be useful to other people I loved, and that being needed by people who'd never weaponized the need was a completely different thing than the needing that had defined my whole childhood. Corinne and I decided to move in together at the end of the summer. It happened without any of the drama I'd braced for. No ultimatums, no keeping score, just the slow, obvious recognition that we spent most nights in the same place anyway, and that a shared lease felt less like a leap than an acknowledgement of where we already were. We found a place with room for both our things, and a second bedroom she could use as a studio for the canoe restoration and other projects that kept multiplying, and a kitchen big enough that we could both be in it at once without stepping on each other. Signing that lease felt different than signing my own had a year earlier. That one had been a flag planted in ground of my own, a declaration that I could stand alone. This one was something else, a choice to let another person all the way in with my eyes open, having learned the hard way what love was and wasn't, having built a working picture of the healthy thing, and now stepping into it on purpose. The day we moved in, my whole chosen family showed up again, Desmond and Nadia and Pilar and Ruben and Marisol, and we made the same disaster of a pizza party we'd made when I moved into my own place, except this time Corinne was moving in beside me instead of helping me settle in alone. At one point in the middle of the chaos, she caught my eye across the room, both of us covered in dust, surrounded by boxes and people who loved us, and she mouthed something I couldn't hear over the noise, and I didn't need to hear it to know what it was, and I felt, standing there, a completeness I would not have believed was available to me 2 years before. The young man from my support group, the one whose family had organized itself around his sick sister the way mine had around Delia, finished his time in the group that fall, and on his last night he stood up and said he wanted to thank everyone, and then he looked at me specifically and said that the first meeting he'd walked in convinced he was a bad brother, and that he was walking out understanding he was just a person who'd finally been allowed to exist. He said he'd set a real boundary with his family, had told them he loved his sister, and would help her in ways that didn't erase him, and that when they'd tried the old guilt on him, he'd recognized it for what it was and hadn't folded. He said his family was furious and that some of them weren't speaking to him, and that for the first time in his life that felt survivable, because he finally had a picture of himself that wasn't drawn entirely by them. I sat there in that circle and felt my throat go tight, because I remembered being exactly where he'd started, and because I knew, watching him, that the thing that had happened to me had traveled forward through me into someone else and come out the other side as freedom. After the meeting, he shook my hand and then changed his mind and hugged me instead, and told me that having someone in the room mom who'd lived it, who'd come out okay, was the thing that had made him believe he could too. Driving home that night, I thought about the man in my very first meeting, the one with the kidney and the manufactured emergency, the one who'd gripped my shoulder while I cried, and I understood that this was how it worked, a chain of people reaching back to pull the next one up, and that I was a link in it now, and that being a link in it was maybe the most meaningful thing I'd ever be. The work with the organization deepened over that year into something I hadn't planned. On the board, I kept coming back to the same gap I'd fallen into myself, the stretch of time between realizing something was wrong and finding anyone who understood, the lonely middle where most people either talk themselves out of what they've seen or get pulled back in. So I helped design a peer mentorship program, pairing people newly out of a coercive family situation with someone a year or two further down the road, someone who could say the specific sentences that only land coming from a person who's lived them. It took months of meetings and false starts and a fair amount of arguing about logistics, but we launched it in the spring, and I mentored the first person match through it, a woman a little younger than me whose parents had spent years pressuring her to give up her nursing career to become the full-time caregiver for a disabled sibling, framing every ambition she had as a betrayal. Walking beside her as she found her footing, watching her learn to say no and survive it, I kept thinking that if this program had existed when I was sitting at my kitchen table at 3 a.m. Googling manufactured medical emergency, the whole climb might have taken half as long and cost me half as much. That was the point. That was the entire point. To build the thing I'd needed and hadn't had, and hand it to the next person before they had to invent it alone in the dark. The holidays came around again, my second season since going no contact, and this time there was no hour of teeth in the morning, no reflexive bracing for a call that wasn't coming. Dahlia hosted again, a bigger crowd this year, more of the relatives who'd quietly come around, and I brought Corinne, and my chosen family had their own gatherings that I moved between. Pilar's enormous chaotic potluck, Nadia's tradition of a terrible movie marathon, a quiet dinner with Desmond and his partner. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, standing in Dahlia's kitchen sneaking food before dinner while her kids argued about a board game in the next room, I realized I wasn't performing anything. I wasn't managing anyone's feelings. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe. I was just a person at a holiday surrounded by people who were glad he was there, and the ordinariness of it, the sheer unremarkable normalcy, was the thing that undid me a little, because I'd spent 30 years believing this was something other people got to have and I didn't. It turned out I'd just been looking for it in the one house where it was never going to be. The test I'd been quietly dreading came in the form of a wedding invitation. My cousin Renata was getting married that summer, and she called me herself to invite me, and then, before I could even ask, she told me the thing I needed to know, which was that my parents would be there, because they were family, and she couldn't uninvite them without a war, but that she wanted me there too, that she'd thought hard about it, and that she'd made sure my seat and theirs were at opposite ends of the room, and that if I needed to leave at any point, she'd already told 2 other cousins to have my back. I sat with the invitation for a week. The old reflex said, don't go, don't risk it, don't hand them a room where they could corner me or make a scene. But I talked it through with Dr. Nasser and with Corinne, and I realized that not going meant letting my parents decide again which rooms I was allowed in, which family events I got to have, and I was done letting them draw those lines. So I went, with Corinne beside me, and I went on my own terms, with an exit plan and people who'd promised to close ranks. And for most of the night it was fine. It was better than fine. It was a wedding, beautiful and boring and warm, and I danced badly and caught up with cousins and watched Renata marry someone who looked at her like she'd hung the moon, and my parents stayed at their end of the room and I stayed at mine, and the distance held. There was one moment near the end when it almost broke. I was getting a drink at the bar and I turned and my mom was suddenly close, 6 feet away, having crossed the room, and for a second the whole night held its breath. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between longing and grievance, and she opened her mouth like she was going to say something, some opening move, some test of whether a year and a wedding and a few drinks had softened me back into someone she could work. And I looked at her, calm, steady, and I didn't move toward her, and I didn't move away. I just held her gaze and let the silence sit there, and I watched her realize, in real time, that the person she was looking for wasn't in me anymore, that the son who managed her feelings and folded under her sadness had grown into someone she didn't have a lever for. She closed her mouth, her eyes went hard for a second, and then, strangely, they went sad, and she turned and walked back to her end of the room. Corinne appeared at my elbow a moment later, and Renata not long after that, both of them ready to run interference that I no longer needed, and I told them I was okay, and I was. I'd stood a body's length from the woman who'd tried to talk me out of an eye, and I'd held my ground without a single word, and the ground had held. And then something happened that I hadn't planned for at all. Delia found me. She came across the room slowly, a little little unsteady still in crowds even with her sight back, and she stopped in front of me, and she looked at me, actually looked at me, taking in my face with eyes that could see it for the first time in years, and her own eyes filled up. She said my name, and then she said quietly, just for me, that she was sorry, that she'd sat in that room and let them do it, that she'd been so lost in her own fear that she'd let herself be used to hurt the one person who'd never once asked her to be anything other than his sister. She said she didn't expect me to forgive her tonight, or maybe ever, that she just needed to say it to my face now that she could see my face, and that she was in therapy, real therapy, trying to understand how she'd become a person who could sit silent while that happened. I stood there with my throat closing, a year and a half of grief and anger and love all rising at once, and I told her that I heard her, that it mattered, that I wasn't ready for more than this, but that this was real, and I wouldn't forget she'd said it. We didn't hug. We weren't there yet, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. But we stood together for a minute at the edge of that wedding, brother and sister, both of us survivors of the same house in different ways, and something that had been slammed shut a year and a half earlier opened, just a crack, just enough to let a little light through. Corinne drove us home that night, and I watched the highway lights go by and didn't say much, and she didn't push, and somewhere around the halfway point I said out loud that I thought maybe, someday, a long way off, my sister and I might find our way to something honest, and that for the first time that possibility didn't scare me, because I knew now that whatever we built would be built on my terms and at my speed, or it wouldn't be built at all. In the months after the wedding, the story that had held my family together for a year and a half started to come apart, and I heard about it the way I heard about everything now secondhand, from the cousins who'd stayed in my corner. Delia, it turned out, had finally said it out loud, not to me, but to our parents. Renata told me that at a family dinner, Delia had stopped everyone and said plainly that the surgery had never been real, that she'd known it was wrong to let them tell me it was, and that she wasn't going to keep sitting inside a lie just because it was more comfortable than the truth. Renata said my mom had tried to shut it down the way she shut everything down, with tears and accusations and a quick pivot to how much she'd suffered, and that for the first time it hadn't worked, because Delia, with her sight back and a year of therapy behind her, hadn't folded. She'd just repeated it, calmly, that it had been a lie, that I'd been telling the truth the whole time, and that she was done pretending otherwise. It didn't fix my family. My parents didn't have some cinematic reckoning, didn't call me sobbing with a full confession, didn't change in any fundamental way. But the story they'd built, the one where I was the unstable villain who'd abandoned his blind sister, could no longer be told at family gatherings without the blind sister herself contradicting it, and that it turned out was enough to collapse it. I felt something settle when I heard it. Not vindication exactly, because I hadn't needed the family to believe me in order to know what was true, but something quieter and more final, the sense of a weight I'd been carrying being set down, not because I'd finally proved my case, but because I'd stopped needing to. Around that same time, my sessions with Dr. Nasser started to space out on their own, from weekly to every other week to once a month, not because anything was wrong, but because there was less and less to bring in. I noticed it one afternoon when I sat down across from her and realized I didn't have a crisis to process, just an ordinary month of an ordinary good life, and she smiled when I said so, and told me that was the goal, that the point of the work was never to keep me in the chair forever, but to give me back to my own life. We spent that session, and a few after it, talking less about my family and more about the future, about the relationship I was building, about the work that had become a calling, about the person I'd become in the wreckage of the person my family had tried to keep me as. She told me, near the end of one of those sessions, that in all her years she'd watched a lot of people survive terrible things, but that survival and thriving were different animals, and that I'd done the harder, rarer thing. I'd taken the exact material that was supposed to break me and built a life out of it. I drove home from that one and had to pull over for a minute. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wasn't. Because a woman I trusted had said out loud the thing I'd started to believe about myself and hadn't quite dared to say. Corinne proposed to me on a Tuesday, which is the least romantic day of the week, in our kitchen, while we were making a dinner that was going badly, and that was exactly why it was perfect. She didn't get down on one knee in some scenic place with an audience. She just turned to me over a pan of something burning and said she'd been thinking about it for a while, that she'd never once had to manage me or perform for me or wonder where she stood, that being with me was the easiest hard thing she'd ever done, and that she wanted to do the rest of it together, and would I marry her. I stood in that kitchen with the smoke alarm about to go off and understood that this was the entire distance I'd traveled, measured in a single moment, because the love I'd grown up with had always come with a ledger, always kept account of what I owed, always made itself conditional on my willingness to disappear into someone else's needs, and here was a person offering me the opposite, a love with no invoice, no strings, no fine print, that asked nothing of me except that I keep being myself. I said yes before she'd finished asking, and we let the dinner burn, and I called Desmond and Nadia and Pilar and Ruben that night, my chosen family, the people who'd carried me here, and every one of them cried, and not one of them was surprised, because they'd all seen it before I had, the way people who actually love you always do. Delia and I met for coffee for the first time that fall, almost 2 years after the meeting in that living room. She'd texted a few weeks earlier asking, evening, with no pressure attached, whether I might ever be open to seeing her, just the two of us, somewhere neutral. And I'd sat with it for a while before I said yes, and I'd made sure it was on my terms, a public place, a weekday, an hour I could end whenever I needed to. I told Corinne and Dr. Nasser and Desmond where I was going, the way you tell people when you're doing something that scares you, and then I drove to a coffee shop halfway between our cities and got there early and picked a table by the window and waited. Delia came in a few minutes later and saw me across the room and lifted her hand, and there was something in that small gesture that got me, because there had been years when she couldn't have picked me out of a crowd at all. We sat across from each other, awkward at first, two people who'd once known each other completely and now had to figure out who the other one had become. And slowly, over an hour that stretched into two, we talked. She didn't make excuses this time. When I asked her, carefully, what she'd been thinking in that living room, she didn't deflect or reframe or slide the weight onto her suffering. She told me the truth, that she'd been so terrified of losing her sight and so desperate for any thread of hope that when our parents built the fantasy of the surgery, she'd let herself half believe it, and that even when some part of her knew it wasn't right, the fear of contradicting our mom had been bigger than the fear of hurting me. She said that was the thing she was most ashamed of, that she'd chosen the easier fear. She said therapy had made her look at all of it, at how she'd let being the fragile one become a kind of power she'd used without ever admitting she was using it. I listened, and I didn't rush to make her feel better, and I didn't pretend it hadn't cost me what it cost me, but I also felt, sitting across from her, the first genuine flicker of the sister I'd grown up loving, the one underneath the years of manipulation and fear, and I let myself feel it without letting it erase anything. We didn't fix everything over one cup of coffee. I told her plainly that I wasn't ready to have our parents anywhere near whatever we might slowly rebuild, that any relationship between us would have to exist entirely outside of them, that I couldn't do the thing where she carried messages or tried to broker a reunion, and that if she couldn't keep our things separate from them, then we couldn't have a thing at all. She said she understood, and that she wanted the same, that she was building her own distance from them in her own way, that seeing again had somehow made it easier to see them clearly too. We agreed to start small, coffee every month or so, no expectations, no performances, just two people trying to find out whether there was something real left under the wreckage. Driving home, I called Corinne and told her it had gone okay, better than okay, and then I sat in the feeling of it for the rest of the evening, the strange, quiet grace of getting a piece of something back that I'd fully grieved as lost, and understanding that even this, even my own sister, only worked because I'd finally learned to hold the door and the boundary at the same time. Corinne and I started planning the wedding that winter, and it was in the planning that I ran into the question I'd known was coming, and had been quietly circling for weeks, which was who I would invite, not the caterer or the venue, the guests, the family, the people who'd stand up on my side of a room and watch me marry someone. For most people, that question is logistics. For me, it was a reckoning. I sat down one night with a blank sheet of paper and started writing names, and the names that came were Desmond, who'd answered the phone the morning my whole life cracked open and had never once flinched since. Nadia and Pilar, my island of misfit toys, who understood the exact grief I carried because they carried their own versions of it. Ruben, who'd slid a therapist's number across a coffee shop table and probably saved my life without ever making a thing of it. Marisol, who'd hung curtains in my first apartment and cried at my board acceptance. Renata and Dahlia and the handful of cousins who'd chosen the truth over the comfortable story. Dr. Nasser, who I'd decided to invite even though I wasn't sure it was allowed, because she'd handed me back my own mind. The list filled the page, and every name on it was a person who'd chosen me freely, with no obligation and no ledger. And the names that weren't on it, my parents, were absent not out of spite, but out of the simple, clear knowledge that a wedding is a gathering of the people who love you as you are, and they never had. I did, after a lot of thought, decide to invite Delia, quietly, with no fanfare, telling her she was welcome but under no pressure, and that our parents were not invited, and that couldn't be negotiated. And she said she understood, and that she'd be honored to come. Writing that list was the closest I came, in the whole 2 years, to a formal accounting of what I'd lost and what I'd built. And when I looked at the finished page, the losses felt smaller than they ever had, because the page was so full. The peer mentorship program I'd helped build got a real grant that spring, enough to expand it into 2 more cities and to bring on a part-time coordinator so it wasn't running on the fumes of a handful of volunteers. At the small celebration the organization held, the director asked me to say a few words, and I stood up and talked about the middle, the lonely stretch between knowing and doing that had almost swallowed me, and about how the whole point of the program was to make sure no one had to cross it alone the way I had. Afterward, the director pulled me aside and told me the program existed because of me, that my insistence on building the specific thing I'd needed had turned into a thing that was now reaching people I'd never meet in cities I'd never visit. I thought about that a lot in the days after, the strange arithmetic of it, that the worst thing my family ever did to me had multiplied, through some process I still didn't fully understand, into help for a widening circle of strangers. The magazine that had run my first essay asked me to write a second one, this time about rebuilding, about what comes after you walk away, about chosen family and boundaries that hold, and the slow work of learning to trust trust the good when you finally find it. I wrote it under the same pen name, and it ran that summer, and the comments filled again with people telling their own stories, and one of them, near the top, was from someone who wrote that they'd read my first piece 2 years earlier, called their own doctor the next day the way I'd described, and had spent the time since building a life they'd never have believed was possible. Reading that comment, I understood that the chain reached forward in ways I'd never see the end of, and that being one link in it, just one, was more than enough to have made all of it mean something. I kept meeting Delia for coffee, once a month, then a little more often, and slowly, carefully, we built something small and real. It wasn't the relationship we might have had in a different family. There were things we'd never get back. Years the manipulation had eaten, a closeness that had been used as a weapon too many times to fully trust again. But there was honesty now, and honesty was a foundation we'd never once stood on as kids. She told me about her recovery, about learning to see again after years of darkness, about the strange grief of getting something back and realizing how much the losing had cost her beyond just her sight. I told her about Corinne, about the wedding, about the work. We were careful with each other, two people who'd learned the hard way that love without boundaries is just another kind of harm, but it was real, and it was ours, and it existed completely outside the house we'd both had to leave in our different ways. It has been about 2 years now since I walked into that living room and found my whole family arranged in a circle, waiting to convince me to give up an eye for a surgery that never existed. I have spent a lot of those 2 years trying to understand how it happened, how a person can be raised so completely inside a lie that the lie feels like love, how you can be taught from before you can talk that your job is to disappear so someone else can be comfortable, and never once notice you've been taught it until the day they ask for a piece of your actual body and something finally refuses. I do not think my parents woke up one morning and decided to be cruel. I think my mom was handed the same machinery by her own parents and never questioned it, ran the only program she was ever given, and genuinely believed right up to the end that a mother who loved her blind daughter enough was entitled to whatever her other child had, including his sight. I think my dad decided 30 years before I was born that surviving my mom mattered more than protecting anyone from her, and that the price of that decision was always going to be paid by whoever was smallest in the room. For most of my life, that was me. And the thing I understand now, the thing it took 2 years and a therapist and a burned letter and a room full of strangers to teach me, is that understanding all of that does not obligate me to walk back into it. You can know exactly why someone is the way they are and still refuse to let them keep being that way in your direction. People ask me sometimes, the ones who know the story, whether I have regrets, whether I miss my parents, whether I'd do it differently, and the honest answer is complicated. I miss the parents I wish I'd had, constantly, the way you can miss a person who never actually existed. I do not miss the parents I had, the ones who blocked a door and threatened to disown me and started a fraudulent fundraiser and told the whole family I'd lost my mind for telling the truth. Those are two different griefs, and I've learned to hold them separately, to let myself mourn the fantasy without ever confusing it for the fact. And no, I would not do it differently. Every hard thing I did, the phone call to Dr. Brennan, the certified letter, the fraud report, the no contact, the burned pages, every one of them was the thing that got me here, to a life I would not trade for any reconciliation built on pretending. I look at where everyone landed. My mom is still telling whatever version of the story lets her sleep, in a smaller and smaller room of people willing to believe it. My dad is still in that house, still choosing peace over truth, though he sent me one real apology once and I keep it, and maybe that's a crack of something. Delia can see again, and she and I have coffee once a month and are slowly, carefully becoming a brother and sister who tell each other the truth, which is more than we ever were when we lived under the same roof. And me, I built a life, a real one, with people who chose me in work that matters, and a person who proposed to me over a burning dinner on a Tuesday because being with me was the easiest hard thing she'd ever done. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I say on the helpline and in the group and in the essays under a name that isn't mine, is that the family you're born into is not a debt you owe with your body. I spent 30 years believing that love meant subtraction, that being a good son and a good brother meant handing over pieces of myself, my scholarship, my inheritance, my car, my choices, my future, and finally, at the end, an actual part of my actual I, and calling the handing over love. It was not love. Love does not run a tab. Love does not manufacture an emergency to get past your judgment before you can use it. Love does not arrange a room of people to outnumber you. Love does not tell you that your 2 working eyes are a thing you're selfishly hoarding from someone who deserves them more. What my family called love was just ownership with a softer name, and the day I stopped paying the tab was the day I found out what love actually was, which is the thing that has been sitting at my table ever since, asking nothing, keeping no count. We had the dinner on a Friday in the spring, almost exactly 2 years after the night I walked out of my parents' house into the dark. It wasn't planned as an anniversary. Corinne and I just wanted to have everyone over, the whole chosen family, to celebrate the engagement properly, in our own place, at our own table. But the date landed where it landed, and I noticed it that morning the way you notice a scar in the mirror, without pain, just recognition, and I decided not to say anything anything about it to anyone, to just let the two nights sit side by side in my own head and see what they had to say to each other. 2 years earlier, there had been a room full of people waiting for me when I arrived, arranged in a circle, and every one of them had wanted to take something. Tonight, there would be a room full of people waiting for me too, and I wanted to see with my own eyes at my own table exactly how different the same picture could be. They started arriving a little after 6. Desmond first, because Desmond is always first, carrying a bottle of something and immediately parking himself in my kitchen to steal food and narrate my cooking, the same way he'd shown up 2 years earlier with 2 coffees and his laptop when my whole life was on fire. He hugged me at the door and held on a second longer than usual and didn't say anything about the date, and I understood that he'd noticed it too, that he'd been keeping his own quiet count of the days since that morning I called him crying, and that he'd decided, like me, to let it be a thing we both knew and neither of us needed to name. Nadia and Pilar came together, loud and already arguing about a movie, Nadia carrying a dessert she'd insisted on making, despite everyone knowing Pilar was the actual baker, the two of them filling my doorway with the specific warmth of people who'd sat with me on 100 bad nights and were here now for a good one. Ruben came with his partner and a bottle of wine, and that same easy watchfulness he'd had at the office, the man who'd noticed I wasn't okay before I'd said a word and had quietly made sure I ate. Marisol came with flowers and cried a little at the door for no reason except that she cries at doors. Renata and Dahlia came, my cousins, the ones who'd chosen the truth when the whole family was choosing the comfortable lie, and Dahlia's kids ran straight for the room where I'd stashed a board game because they'd learned my apartment had good games. Dr. Nasser came, which still surprised me that I'd asked, and she'd said yes, standing a little formally in my living room until Corinne handed her a glass of wine and folded her into the noise. And Delia came. Last, a little nervous, standing in my doorway with a wrapped gift held in front of her like a shield, her eyes, her working eyes, moving around the room full of strangers and landing on me. I crossed the room and let her in, and I felt the whole shape of the last 2 years fold into that single small act, my sister, who could see again, walking into a home I'd built entirely outside the reach of the people who'd made us both, invited on my terms and standing on the far side of a boundary that had finally made a real relationship possible. She hugged me carefully, and I let her, and it was not the hug of people who were healed. It was the hug of people who were trying, and trying was so much more than we'd ever had. The dinner itself was loud and imperfect and completely alive. The food was fine, some of it better than fine, some of it a little burned, and nobody kept score. People talked over each other and laughed too hard at jokes that weren't that funny and told stories I'd heard before and would happily hear again. Nadia gave a toast to the engagement that started as roast and ended unexpectedly in tears, and Pilar had to finish it for her. Ruben told the story of the therapist's napkin, which I'd forgotten he even remembered, and raised his glass to the fact that the guy he'd been worried about across the office 2 years ago was getting married. Dahlia's kids performed a dance nobody asked for. Dr. Nasser, who I'd only ever seen in the quiet of her office, laughed at something Desmond said, and I saw for a second the whole strange, beautiful improbability of it, that these people, gathered from every corner of the wreckage, had somehow become a family. Corinne caught my eye across the table more than once, the way she had on moving day, and every time she did, I felt the thing I'd stopped being able to feel by the time I was 10 and had spent 2 years relearning, which is what it is to be somewhere you are wanted for no reason at all, wanted for nothing, wanted just because you are the person you are. Partway through the night, Delia found me in the quiet by the window, away from the noise for a minute, and she handed me the gift she'd carried in like a shield. I unwrapped it slowly. It was a framed drawing, one of her own, done since the surgery, since her hands had learned to work with eyes that could guide them again. It was our old backyard, the one from the house we'd both had to leave in our different ways, the big tree we'd climbed as kids, rendered in careful ink, and in the corner, small, 2 figures, a boy and a girl, sitting up in the branches. She said she'd drawn it thinking about the versions of us that existed before any of it, before the diagnosis and the fear and the lie, back when we were just a brother and a sister in a tree, and that she wanted me to have it, not as a way of pretending the rest hadn't happened, but as a way of remembering that the rest wasn't the whole story, that there had been something real underneath once, and that she thought maybe there could be again. I stood there holding it, and I felt my eyes go hot, and I told her it was the best thing anyone had ever given me, and I meant it. It was the first thing she'd ever offered me with no ask attached, no guilt, no leverage, no invoice, just a drawing of a tree from a person who could finally see it again. I hung it in the hallway the next morning, and I still stop in front of it sometimes. Near the end of the dinner, before dessert, I stood up to say something, which I hadn't planned to do. I'm not a person who makes speeches, but I looked around that table, at all of them, and something rose up in me that had to be said out loud. I told them I wasn't going to do a whole thing, and everyone laughed because they knew I was about to do a whole thing. I told them that 2 years ago, almost to the night, I'd stood in a room full of people who were supposed to be my family, and that every one of them had wanted something from me, and that I'd walked out of that room believing I'd just lost everything, believing that a person who leaves his family ends up with nothing. And I told them that I'd been wrong, that leaving that room hadn't cost me a family, It had cost me a counterfeit of one, and that everything real, everything that was actually a family, I'd found afterward, in the wreckage, in this room, at this table. I said I used to think family was the people who were obligated to you and you to them, a set of debts you were born already owing, and that they'd taught me, all of them, each in their own way. That family is just the people who show up and keep showing up and never once hand you a bill for it. My voice cracked somewhere in the middle, and Desmond yelled something to give me a second to recover, and everyone laughed again, and I got to the end and raised my glass and said that I was the luckiest person I knew, not despite the family I'd lost, but because losing them was what cleared the ground for this. And they raised their glasses back, all of them, my chosen and my reclaimed and my found, and Corinne reached over and took my hand, and I sat back down in a room full of people who had waited for me, and this time not one of them wanted anything but for me to be exactly who I was. Dessert turned into its own small chaos. Pilar's cake and Nadia's contested rival dessert set side by side on the counter, while everyone pretended to judge them fairly, and then ate both. Dahlia's kids campaigned hard for a second helping and got it, and the younger one fell asleep sitting up in an armchair somewhere around the second round of coffee, a fork still in his hand, and nobody moved him. We just talked more quietly on that side of the room. Reuben cornered me by the sink at one point while I was rinsing plates, and he didn't say anything sentimental. That isn't his way. He just bumped my shoulder with his and said it was good to see, all of it, and that he'd meant to tell me a while back that watching me come out of that year had made him call his own sister for the first time in 3, and that it hadn't fixed anything, but it had been the right thing to try, and that he'd never have done it if he hadn't watched me do the harder version first. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just handed him a dish towel, and he took it, and we did the dishes side by side for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. Dr. Nasser found me before she left. She'd stayed longer than I expected, and she put on her coat in the hallway under Delia's framed drawing of the tree, and she paused in front of it for a second, and then she looked at me and said that in her office she only ever gets to see the middle of the story, the worst of it, the part where people are still in the woods, and that she almost never gets to see this part, the after, the table full of people, the life on the far side. She said thank you for letting her see it, and I told her the truth, which is that there wasn't a version of this table that existed without her, that she'd handed me back my own mind at a point when I genuinely wasn't sure I'd get it back, and that everyone laughing in the next room was, in a way she'd never take credit for, partly her doing. She squeezed my arm once, the way she used to at the end of a hard session, and she said to take care of myself, and then she was gone, out into the spring night, and I stood under my sister's drawing for a minute before I went back in. The night wound down the way goodnights do, slowly, in stages, people leaving in 2s and 3s with leftovers pressed into their hands, and promises to do it again soon that everyone actually meant. Renata and Dahlia gathered the kids, the sleeping one carried out draped over a shoulder, and hugged me at the door and told me they were proud of me, my cousins, the ones who'd chosen the truth, and I held on to that. Nadia and Pilar left last of the friends, Nadia declaring the dessert competition a draw purely to keep the peace, both of them hugging me hard, and Pilar whispering that this was the best one yet, and I knew she meant more than the dinner. Delia stayed a few minutes after that, helping Corinne stack the last of the plates, the two of them talking easily in a way that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier, and then she gathered her coat, and I walked her to the door. We stood there for a second, brother and sister, in the doorway of a home that existed entirely outside the house we'd grown up in. She said, "Thank you for having her." I said, "Thank you for the drawing." Neither of us said any of the bigger things because we didn't need to and because we weren't there yet, but she looked at me with her clear working eyes and I looked back, and something passed between us that was quiet and real and enough. Then she was gone too, down the stairs, out to her car, and it was just me and Corinne and a kitchen full of dishes and the particular warm ringing silence a home has, right after it's been full of people who love you. Corinne and I cleaned up together the way we did everything, easily, no negotiation about who did what, just two people moving around a kitchen they shared. She washed and I dried and we didn't talk much, both of us tired in the good way, and after a while she kissed me on the shoulder and said she was going to bed, and told me not to stay up too late and left me with the last few pans and the quiet. I finished them slowly, and then I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room, which an hour ago had been full of everyone I love, and was now just chairs pushed at odd angles and a couch with the cushions dented where people had sat, and I stood in the middle of it, and I let myself do the thing I'd been not quite doing all night. I let the two rooms lie down on top of each other. 2 years ago there had been lamps on in the daylight, and a plate of cookies nobody ate because the cookies were never the point. They were set dressing for an ambush. Tonight there were dishes in the rack and crumbs of two rival desserts that had both been demolished, because tonight the food was the point. Tonight the food was just love you could put on a plate. 2 years ago there had been a circle of chairs arranged so I'd be outnumbered, every seat filled by someone who wanted a piece of me. Tonight there were chairs shoved every direction, dragged close together, pulled up to make room for one more, and every person who'd sat in them had come to give me something and take nothing. 2 years ago my mom had stood between me and the door and told me I wasn't leaving until I agreed to hand over my sight, told me that walking out that door meant walking out of the family forever. Tonight the door had opened and closed a dozen times times, gently, people coming and going as they pleased, nobody blocking it, nobody threatening anything, and the last person through it had been my sister, who could see again, hugging me on her way out into a spring night. 2 years ago, I had walked out of a room full of family believing I had just lost everything. Tonight, I was standing in a room full of the family that walking out had made room for. Same picture. A room full of people waiting for me. And the entire difference between the worst night of my life and the best one was the single thing every person in each of those rooms had wanted from me. One room wanted to take an eye. The other room wanted nothing at all. That was the whole lesson. The thing it cost me 2 years and a family to learn. My mom demanded that I give my corneas to my blind sister. I gave her the truth instead, and the truth turned out to be a door. I walked through it thinking it led to nothing, to loneliness, to a life without a family. It led here, to a kitchen with 2 people's things in it, to a hallway with a drawing of a tree, to a table that had been full an hour ago and would be full again, to people who showed up and kept showing up and never once handed me a bill. I stood in my quiet living room, 2 years to the night from the one I'd fled, and I understood that I had not lost my family that night. I had finally gone looking for one, and I had found it, and it had been waiting for me all along, on the far side of the only word that had ever set me free. The truth, that was enough.